Order, order. And first of all, could I welcome you all to the Scottish Affairs Committee's inquiry into population and demography in Scotland. It's a couple of little bits of housekeeping before we get underway. I think this is probably the first time that a Westminster Select Committee has been to the island of Skye. It's certainly the first time we've been to Slate in southern Skye, so we're absolutely delighted to be here. It's my obligation and responsibility to tell you this is a formal proceedings of the House of Commons, so unfortunately there will be no contributions from sedentary positions, as we say in the House of Commons. It's a very formal exercise in obtaining and acquiring evidence. We're down to a bare minimum of the committee. I think you all probably understand that Westminster's in quite an excitable state just now. Our government colleagues who are on the committee unfortunately can't be with us as it's the first round of voting in the Conservative leadership contest, and our colleagues in the Labour Party are a little bit detained themselves. So we have a quorum of the committee here today, but we're absolutely delighted that we're able to continue with this session, and we're delighted again for Sabhal Mòr Ostaig for generously hosting this committee in here, and we're looking forward to securing the evidence that we get today. And that brings us to our first witness, which is Professor Jim Hunter. For the record, Professor Jim Hunter, if you'd like to tell us who you are, who you represent, and if you have anything in the way of an opening statement.
Well, I don't really represent any organisation. I'm speaking in a purely personal capacity. I'm Emeritus Professor of History at the University of the Highlands and Islands. Emeritus Professor is just a fancy way of saying I've retired. And but I've also had a long involvement in the Highlands and Islands, not least here in Skye, in regard to community development and land reform and many other matters.
We're grateful. Professor Hunter, we're very, very grateful for your written evidence, which is very extensive and substantial, and in your written evidence you talk about the centuries of emigration from the Highlands and Islands and how this was addressed in the 1960s. Could you first of all just tell us just a little bit about some of the cultural and historic background to the story of emigration from the Highlands and Islands and how that fits into the general picture of Scotland in a context?
Well, this is an area not just here in Skye, though Skye was very much at the centre of that, but across the Highlands and Islands as a whole, this was an area characterised for a very, very long time by runaway population loss. The Highlands and Islands had a much higher proportion of the overall Scottish population if you go back to the 18th century and presumably beyond that, though details are scanty once you go further back. But that began to change in the 19th century, and particularly with the Highland clearances and related events, and particularly as a result of the famine of the 1840s. The population outflow became so extensive that it just began to run away altogether, and we were for many, many years, for well over 100 years, this was an area where, taking the region as a whole, the population was constantly falling. I think it's perhaps worth emphasising, I've tried to indicate that in the paper I sent you, that we are in Skye, in a place that was particularly badly scarred by many of these developments. This was probably the area of the whole Highlands and Islands that was worst affected by the famine. And, okay, that was in the 1840s. In one respect, it seems a long time ago. It's only 2 human lifetimes ago. And yet there were scenes here then of the sort that nowadays we would see, and still see, sadly, occasionally, of course, on our television screens, happening in the most disadvantaged and fragile parts of Africa. But that was common here in the 1840s, starvation and all the rest. And it was out of that there came the mass emigrations that followed.
And in your written evidence, I think the committee found fascinating as you went through a series of episodes, starting, I think, in 1760 with the landlord-led clearances, then the famine in the 1840s. But then beyond that, there did seem to be other episodes where there was mass emigrations from the Highlands and Islands area, like the post-war was again issues. Was there anything that, or could you give us your view about why it seems to have been a centuries-long series of emigrations from the Highlands, and is there anything that's beyond that other than the initial clearances and the famine, and what happened after that?
Well, I think once a locality gets into that cycle, it becomes very, very difficult to break. This was, I grew up not in this part of the area, but in the north part of Argyll, I was born in 1948, and so I grew up as a wee boy in the 50s and went to secondary school in the 60s. And that was a time when people were still leaving, and it was the kind of, it wasn't something we even really thought about very much. It was just the way things were, like the weather. It might have been nicer if it was different, but that was just the way it was. And there was a universal notion that if you were going to get on in the world, you had to get out, that there was nothing here for anybody very much. And worse than that, there was a notion, I think, very strongly that any younger person who was still around the place, so to speak, when they were into their 20s, was almost by definition a failure, that success was something that only happened somewhere else. And that was a very, very difficult thing to break. And it's one of my contentions in this paper that in terms of government policy, the key to breaking it was the increasing recognition that goes back to the 1880s in the first instance, and the first Crofters Act of 1886, and the recognition that there should be security of tenure and there should be no more mass evictions and so on. That was the beginning of a recognition that the Highlands and Islands were a particularly difficult area, a unique area in mainland British terms, and that some particular institutional initiatives had to be taken here to break out of that cycle. But even with that, even with the beginnings of that, even with security of tenure, the end of clearance and eviction and all the rest, with the beginnings of housing improvement and much else, you were still seeing people leaving. And as this is an area here in Slate, which was the most depopulated, depressed and deprived part of what was an island that was in much the same state, but here it was particularly acute. And in the 1950s, people studying this locality and Skye more generally were of the opinion that this was just going to continue indefinitely. If it had continued at the rate that it was going up until the 1950s here in Skye, there would, if you extrapolate the downward trend, because there were 24,000 people in Skye in the 1840s, and by the beginning of the 1960s there weren't much more than 6,000 or 7,000. And if that downward trend had continued, there'd be nobody left at all now. So you get a sense of just how difficult it was to break. And but also I think what's really important to emphasize is the huge effort that government put into trying to turn it round.
We want to ask you specifically about this, but just staying on some of the historical stuff just now. I mean, what we're looking at as a committee is we want to try and understand what's different about Scotland's population, why we lag behind the rest of the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union averages in terms of securing a higher population. And we have what's called a dependency ratio, where we have a shrinking working age population vis-a-vis an ageing population. Is there anything that you could describe as, and I'm trying to get to the culture of why Scotland's issues are different from the United Kingdom. Do you think that the experience of the Highlands through emigration, through these seismic episodes of famine and clearances, has that had an impact upon how we view emigration, which maybe makes us different to the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, it's certainly in a Highland context. It just became something that was constantly ongoing. And I'm old enough to remember that myself, when several of my cousins left for places like Canada and Australia when I was a kid. And that just seemed to be the way things were. I think also, and I feel very strongly about this, and I think it's the successful turning around of this that accounts for the success story that is the Highlands more recently, or much of the Highlands. What began to take hold here was a process that I've called in my paper, and it's a term borrowed from anti-colonial theorists like Edward Said, a process of inferiorization. And that is when people begin to buy into the notion that their area has no future. And worse than that, they begin to buy into the notion that because people here were told by folk in authority over several generations that everything about them, starting with the language, the culture, and things as basic as that, were inferior, second rate, and of no account. And of course, once you begin to buy into that, once you begin to think there is no future here, and all of this has really just got to be put to one side if we're going to get on, and we're only going to get on if we leave, then there is no self-confidence, there is no self-esteem, and these are the key to enterprise and initiative of any kind. It wasn't that there was some sort of genetic weakness, as it were, about people from a Highland background. Rather the opposite. They were often very, very successful commercially and in other ways once they'd gone to Canada or the United States or wherever. But there was a very pervasive conviction within the locality itself, encouraged by the way that it was viewed from outside, that there was no future for people here. And that, I think, has been very hard to break. And I wouldn't argue that it's completely broken even yet, but I would argue that there's been a huge sea change, of which this development here is perhaps the most emblematic and most obvious result of that. There's been a huge sea change in the last 30, 40 years, but it's not been an easy process. And it has definitely, it's something, of course, that is, the experience here is different to that of lowland Scotland or of the Central Belt, because for much of the 19th century, that area was in some respects very prosperous, and certainly its population was growing. And of course, many of the people who left this area, who did not go overseas, settled in places like Glasgow and West Central Scotland and worked in industry there. But of course, in the interwar years, that all began to fall apart and people began to leave in large numbers. But there is, as others have observed, it's not my area of expertise, but there is something very peculiar about Scotland in this regard, because Scotland was, on the face of it, in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, one of the most successful economies in the world in terms of industrial development. But it was still, even throughout that period, characterized by out-migration. Now that's very, very unusual. Most localities in the world that are at the forefront of development at any particular phase are the other way around. The places that people are flocking into. Now there was a degree of that, of course, in lowland Scotland, particularly people moving in from Ireland. But even throughout that period, a lot of our own folk were still leaving. And that kind of sense of Scotland being a place that people left was, I think, became very deeply rooted, as it did also in Ireland, of course.
I'm grateful. Maybe now we could sort of address about some of the things that have been done to try and tackle some of these issues. And in your paper again, you highlight a number of interventions that happened when this was recognised as a problem. First of all, could you talk about when it emerged as a problem, this historic emigration? And I know you mentioned the Crofters Act again as one of the first pieces of interventions that government tried to address this. And there was others that you mentioned in your paper too, but I think we get up to the 1960s where the development of the Highlands and Islands Development Board, I think, is one that you identify. Could you maybe talk about why, first of all, answer why there was a sense of a need to address this issue of immigration and government policy interventions, and how successful they've been in trying to address that?
Well, the problems of the Highlands were thrust upon the attention of government and the wider British world, so to speak, by people within the area itself, often taking direct action, not least here in Skye, which was a centre in the 1880s of riot, revolution and rebellion of various kinds. And that's what thrust the policy, the problem of the Highlands to the forefront. And that's what resulted in the Crofters Act and the beginnings of a whole series of inquiries and initiatives to try and do something about it. But it became obvious as the 20th century went on that despite all these initiatives, the problem hadn't been solved because population was still falling. And that was particularly severe and very marked in the 1950s. And there was a contrast then between, this was the time when Harold Macmillan, the then Tory Prime Minister, was telling people in Britain that they'd never had it so good. And yet here in the Highlands, as people were constantly remarking, this was one of the most depressed localities in the British Isles. And it was still characterised by heavy population loss and out-migration to a quite remarkable extent. In the space of 20 years, the population in some parts of the Highlands fell by a quarter or more. And that was the most visible evidence of this. I think it's important to stress that all these efforts that were made, that you can argue, well, population was still falling, so they didn't work. On the other hand, I think if these things hadn't been done, the situation would have been even worse if there had been no security of tenure. I highlight in particular the achievements of the Hydro Board. And, you know, we today in Scotland, and not least here in the islands, it seems virtually impossible to get super fast broadband into localities like this.
I know what you're commenting about, it was possible to get everybody connected to the
Yeah,
national grid, but
and
not
yet
into broadband yet.
The Hydro Board, here was a state agency. State agencies nowadays are regarded with some suspicion, but here was a state agency that managed to connect virtually every home, not every home, but 99.9% or more of homes in the Highlands and Islands to the national grid, with very, very heavily subsidised connection rates. Now, if that hadn't happened, if there was no provision of electricity, then the demographic situation, I think, would have got completely out of hand. But even with that, people were still leaving. And then you've got the effort that is recognised by the Highlands and Islands Development Board. And I quote a bit of his speech in the paper I've written. But it's remarkable now to read Willie Ross, who was then the Secretary of State for Scotland, speaking to the House of Commons in 1965, just after the Harold Wilson's Labour government had been established, and what the government was proposing to do for the Highlands. And you know, by present standards, it was utterly remarkable and visionary and farsighted, and it was going to tackle all these issues. And it was, though Ross was careful to emphasise that the problem wouldn't be solved overnight, but the aim was to really turn the place around. And you know, that's remarkable. We don't seem to have that capacity to really take these radical steps now anymore, which is a shame.
What particularly did the Highlands and Islands Development Board offer the Highlands, and what did it do to address it? I mean, of all the interventions that you know in your paper, this was the most dramatic one, and the one that seems to have had that cultural shift and change. What was about it that led to the success?
Well, I think myself that the key to it, and you know, these are complex matters, and there's perhaps, you know, there's no one silver bullet, but one key to it was the extraordinarily wide powers that the Highland Board was given, and that were transferred largely to Highlands and Islands Enterprise by the Tories in around about 1990. But most development agencies, and Scottish Enterprise is a good example of this, most of them have a very narrow economic development focus. They are solely concerned with business development and job creation. They build, that was the fashion for a long time, they build factories, offices and so on. They look to help business in a very direct, grant-fronted way. Now, all of that is significant. I'm not for a moment arguing that that shouldn't be done. But when you have the sort of situation that I tried to describe and describe in more detail in my submission in the Highlands and Islands, where you have the society so far gone, where you have this demoralisation and what I've called inferiorisation, where there is a lack of enterprise and initiative, then you have to start further back, in my view. And that's why it was so critical that the Highland Board was given powers to intervene in all sorts of ways. And you had a little informal presentation just before this session started about the work of Sabhal Mòr Ostaig here. And the point was made there, and made forcefully, and I think very correctly, that what the Highland Board did, and HIE has been doing also, but it was the Highland Board that pioneered this, was to begin to invest not just in business, as it were, in a direct sense, but in cultural and other initiatives that began to give people much more of a sense of pride in their own locality, a sense that there was something here to be proud of, a sense of that there was something worthwhile about the place that you know, previous generations had been encouraged to feel was not the case.
I found, and just sorry on that point, because that was one of the most fascinating details in your paper, that, you know, when I was reading it, that you saying that the cultural investment was probably just as important as the infrastructure investment. And you know, we had the Gaelic Fund that was established in the 1990s of development, Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. Could you tell us just a little bit about, you know, like what that is and what that means and represents, and you know, can you repopulate areas on the back of cultural activity?
Well, I think it's not just the cultural activity is important in its own right, in the sense that, you know, if you have various cultural activities, they themselves generate economic spin-offs in a very direct way. It's much more deep-seated than that. It's to make people feel good about the place and about themselves. And once that begins to happen, then that has all sorts of indirect spin-offs. Because somebody who does feel good about their locality, about their background, about their heritage, and I don't just mean this in some kind of ethnic sort of way whereby it could only apply to folk who can prove that their family have been here for the last 20 generations. It's just as important for people moving into the locality to feel that they're coming to a place that's a bit distinctive, that has particular things to offer. Not just perhaps in the strictly cultural sense, but environmentally and so on as well. And today, I think, if you think, for instance, again, I'm just talking personally here, one of the things that's quite strikingly different about the Highlands and Islands now, and for young people here as compared to when I was growing up, is the huge sort of enthusiasm that there is, for instance, for traditional music and the like. And that is quite, and you yourself, Chairman, of course, have had something to do with that, but I won't get into that. Now that might seem at one level, well, that's all very nice and cosy, and you know, we all like a good tune, and it's nice to go to a ceilidh and whatnot. But it's far more. It goes way beyond that, and that's I think what's important about what's been happening here, and what's difficult to sometimes explain to developmental economists and others elsewhere. You know, if I was to make this pitch to Scottish Enterprise, I remember actually when I became chairman of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, the first meeting I went to in Scottish Enterprise's headquarters in Glasgow, there was a picture, there was a representational map on the wall of the room, and it was to do with inward investment into Scotland and business development, and where factories had been set up and so on. And so Scotland was projected onto this map in a way that showed this, so that there were glitzy buildings in Dundee and Edinburgh and elsewhere. And the Highlands were represented by a thatched cottage and a Highland cow. And that was in Scotland, say, mainstream development agency. And I thought, gee, you know, what we're trying to do in the Highlands is, you know, it's just out with the ken of these folk. And that, I think that's still difficult to get across. And but it is to me fundamental. And you know, if you look around you here at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, this is perhaps the most striking instance of that sort of thinking.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm coming on to education. Do you feel that the availability of further and higher education has made the Highlands and Islands a more attractive place to be, to live? And how do you feel that will affect the Highlands and Islands population in the future? Will it be favourable or otherwise?
Yeah, it'll certainly be favourable. It's favourable already. It's a key development. I think the establishment of the University of the Highlands and Islands is one of the most important things that's happened here in the last 20, 30 years. In fact, I would argue it's the most important. It's not simple. There is a kind of notion sometimes put about, well, this will stop all the young folk going away. I don't think for a moment it'll stop all the young folk going away. And indeed, I think if I was an 18-year-old growing up in the Highlands today, I might still want to go away because I think that's in the nature of very many young people, that they want to experience different localities and all the rest, different cultures, different things. But I think it nevertheless opens up all sorts of opportunities to people within the area who previously were denied those sorts of opportunities, particularly because, of course, getting a higher education today is a much more expensive process, difficult process for the individual than it was when I was lucky enough to get a university grant and go off to university in 1967. But I think what UHI is about, and we see it here, is creating not just opportunities for young folk who are already here, but creating opportunities also for young folk from elsewhere. And So I think it will help young folk it will help a proportion of our own young folk to make a life here. It will create opportunities for young people who leave to come back again, because most obviously there were no academic jobs in the Highlands and Islands until UHI appeared, no high-level academic jobs anyway. And all the research and other effort that's going on, these are all terribly important. And I think it'll also, and we're beginning to see signs of this already, as UHI becomes more established and gets better and better reputation, as I think it will do, then we will see more, as we're seeing already, we'll see more people coming from elsewhere. Because just as it might be attractive for a young person from Skye or Lewis or wherever to go off to Edinburgh or London or Cambridge or someplace to get a higher education, the opposite also applies. There are plenty of young people in Britain and beyond who would quite fancy, who have perhaps grown up in cities, who would fancy spending 3 or 4 years in a place like this. So I think it's terribly, terribly important, and the fact that we didn't have a university was one of the absolute downsides. I think I quote somewhere in this paper something I said once upon a time, that to people of my generation, getting 3 good hires in secondary school and a university grant was the equivalent of getting a place on an immigrant ship for an earlier.
I think one of the next questions I wanted to ask was about the EU referendum result and how that is going to impact on the future of the population of the Highlands and Islands regarding retaining migrants. You know, obviously it's now completely up in the air because of the outcome. How do you feel that will that affect you and the college here?
Well, I think it'll affect potentially. It depends, of course, what happens and whether we can retain by one means or another our membership of the European Union. That's clearly going to be very difficult if we remain part of the UK, but perhaps we better not get into that. But if we lose our access, if the Highlands and Scotland generally cease to be part of the European Union, as is obviously very possible now, then that will be, in my view, an unremittingly bad thing. And again, this is as good an example as any. What you see around you here would not exist, certainly not in its present form, if it hadn't been for European Union investment. And that sort of situation is replicated right across the region. I think even more fundamentally, and I know you're going to hear later this morning from the Brains, family who've been in the news, who want to make their home in the Highlands and who, under present UK immigration regulations, might not be permitted to do so. And we're going to conceivably see that on a much larger scale. Coming here this morning, I listened to Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, being interviewed on the Today programme on the radio. He was asked repeatedly if he would offer a guarantee, or if he thought a guarantee should be offered to residents of the European Union currently living and working in the UK, that they would be permitted, irrespective of what happens next, to remain here, and he refused to issue such a guarantee. I think that's deplorable. Though I've stressed in this paper that we've seen, and Skye, of course, has seen this in very large terms. We've seen repopulation here over the last 30, 40 years to a quite remarkable extent. This is still one of the relatively few parts of Europe outside northern Scandinavia where there are still many fewer people today than there were 200 years ago. If there is a case for arguing that Britain is overcrowded and can't accept any more migrants, then wherever that case applies, it most certainly and indubitably does not apply to the Highlands and Islands. We need all the people we can get. I feel personally very strongly about this. I think easily the best thing that has happened to the Highlands and Islands in my lifetime is that for the first time in a very long time, far more people have been moving into the Highlands and Islands in the last 30, 40 years and have been moving out. I think that's extraordinarily beneficial to the area. I think if you live in a community where the population is falling, or the young folk in particular are disappearing like snow off a dike, then it is extraordinarily difficult to envisage any good future for that community. We've seen in the Highlands the beginnings of that being turned around, and an important component of that is people coming into the area from elsewhere.
Christoph.
Yes, I really want to ask a question about how policymakers are informed today. Very often are short term, lucky if it's 5 years of planning ahead, but history is great for teaching us perhaps where we could be looking further into the long future. I wanted to ask, what lessons can be learned for current policymakers from the history of both the population decline and the growth in the Highlands and Islands?
Well, I think on the latter point, I've called in this paper the Highlands and Islands a Scottish success story. I believe that's the case. It's important, and I stress this in the paper, that of course that success is not universal in the Highlands and Islands. There are exceptions to it. Even here within Skye, what we see around us here in Slate is not replicated at the north end of Skye, in the Staffin area, for instance. And so there continue to be difficulties in the area that need to be addressed. I feel myself, and ultimately that's my opinion, but I think it can be backed up by evidence, that an absolute key to our success, or such success as we've had, is creating as much autonomy as possible within the locality. And I've stressed the importance of HIDB, HIE in this regard, that it was given remarkably wide powers. It was also given powers to, within limits, do what it liked. and the limits, particularly initially, were pretty slack. And, we talked a moment ago about the University of the Highlands and Islands. The University of the Highlands and Islands was conceived as a project, particularly by two people, Bob Cowan, who was then the chairman of the HIDB, this is towards the end of the 1980s, and Val McKeever, who was a councillor, who was then the chair or the convener of Highland Regional Council's Education Committee. And they set out, with the backing, obviously, of the HIDB and the council and others, to create a university in the Highlands. Now, they didn't ask anyone's permission. They didn't say to anyone in Edinburgh or London, do you think it'd be okay if we do this? They just did it. Now, HIE today and Highland Council today couldn't possibly do that, in my view. And that, I mentioned in the bygoing in the paper when I got to this point, that I make these points not because of a party political feeling, because of I'm a member of the SNP, but because I think that one of the downsides of what we've seen in Scotland in the last 10 years has been a throwing into reverse of that extension of greater autonomy to areas like the Highlands and Islands. And there has been a re-centralisation, both in respect of the Highlands to Edinburgh, and within the Highlands and Islands themselves, there's been a re-centralisation in Inverness. When I lived in Skye in the 1980s and 1990s, Skye had its own district council, Skye and Lahalsh District Council. It had its own local enterprise company, Skye and Lahalsh Enterprise. And these were very small organisations, at least organisations serving very small populations, but they had a degree of autonomy. They were recognised very widely as being highly effective. They undoubtedly contributed substantially to the turnaround that we began to see at that time in Skye. But today there is no such local authority. There is only Highland Council in Inverness, and there are no local enterprise companies because they were abolished by the SNP government, and all power, as it were, now resides again with HIE in Inverness. And HIE itself, rather than being the autonomous organisation with capacity, as Willie Ross said, to do what it thought necessary at its own hand, is regarded by the Scottish Government as a delivery agency, that's the phrase that's used, whose job is to deliver policy that is conceived centrally in Edinburgh. Now, I think that in relation to the sort of better news story that we have to tell now about the Highlands, that is all bad news. I don't mean that it's going to put the whole thing, put the kibosh on it all. It's not. But I think if there's a lesson from what went before, it's that we do better to not believe that devolution of power should stop in Edinburgh, but that it should extend into localities like this. And we've seen a reversal of that process in the last 10 years, and that's a pity, I think.
We're going to extend the session just another 5 minutes or so because we're very grateful for your evidence, Professor Hunter, and I think the committee's thoroughly enjoying this. I don't know, Chris, lost further questions. That's all right with my colleagues, yeah. Chris.
I just want to ask also, moving back onto EU and EU funding, how big an impact has EU funding been in the growth of population in the Highlands and Islands, and what concerns do you have given the result of Brexit with regards to that?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it's been fundamental. I think the European Union's been very, very good for the Highlands and Islands in all sorts of ways, in a funding sense. I think it goes beyond that, though. It's kind of put the Highlands and Islands in touch. I mean, for instance, again, I keep drawing on the example of Sabhal Mòr Ostaig just because that's where we happen to be. But quite a lot of the, well, I don't know how big a proportion of the success of Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, but it's certainly been a constant theme in Sabhal Mòr Ostaig's development, is to develop links with other comparable parts of Europe, and particularly, and for obvious reasons, in the case of Sabhal Mòr Ostaig and Gaelic culture and language, to develop links with Ireland. And all of that has been facilitated by the fact that here and Ireland, both parts of Ireland, the Republic and the North, are in the European Union. And there have been particular European programs that have assisted exchanges of young people, that have assisted the development of universities and contact between them, all of that. And all of that has been jeopardized. So it's not just the loss or the potential loss of the hard cash that has gone into facilities like this, or even gone into roads and harbours and all the other things that the European Union has funded, but or helped very substantially to fund. But it's the cutting off again potentially of these contacts, and as I stressed earlier, the possibility that we cease, or that it becomes more difficult to attract people from other parts of Europe to make their lives here, which I think would be a very, very great shame.
And my last question really is, what do you think is required to continue ensuring the growth of population here? And is there an optimum level of population in the area that it's hoped to be achieved?
Well, optimum levels of population are very difficult concepts. It used to be argued by historians with whom I passionately disagree that that all that happened here in the past, it was all perhaps a bit difficult, but it was just inevitable because the population had exceeded the capacity of the land to sustain it. Well, the population of London has exceeded the capacity of the London area to grow potatoes and turnips a heck of a long time ago. So it depends entirely what sort of economy you're looking to create here. And if, in terms, this is not a locality that is ever, there are agricultural opportunities here, but it is not, for obvious reasons, ever going to be the agricultural breadbasket of Europe, Scotland, or indeed anywhere else. But it is a place that offers all sorts of opportunities. I used to make parallels between here and the Pacific Northwest of the US. It's interesting if you look across North America, and indeed Europe, the continent, that some of the most buoyant areas in respect of information technology and so on, you think of places like the Seattle area, the Vancouver area, and all of that. What attracts people to these places is partly the natural environment, the ease of access to a highly attractive natural environment, the creation of the sort of infrastructure in terms of IT and the like that makes all sorts of other developments possible. And there's absolutely no reason why that can't happen here. This is a very attractive place. The world was very different 1,500 years ago. But if you find yourself in Dublin with a few moments to spare, I would strongly advocate going to Trinity College and looking at the exhibit there on the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells is recognised to be probably the greatest surviving artefact of the early artistic artefact of the early Middle Ages in Europe. And where was that produced? It was produced in the island of Iona. And the island of Iona then was seen not just in Scotland and in Ireland, but much further afield as a centre of not just of spirituality, but of learning and high culture. And so there is no inherent and intrinsic reason why the Highlands, despite what we've been told or what we used to be told forever, there's no inherent reason why this place is remote, peripheral, on the margins, with no great future possibility. It once was at the centre of Europe, and it can be at the centre of Europe again.
We're really grateful, Professor Hunter, and that was fascinating evidence from our I think you've set the frame of the day expertly, and thank you for that. I mean, as always with witnesses before this committee, if there's anything that you feel that like you could further share with us, either one of your fascinating papers, for example, would be helpful, or anything that we've missed in the course of inquiry, we are obviously always open for further written evidence, and we'd welcome you to do that. But thank you very much for coming along to the session today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit here.
I'm sure we will. Can we have the next panel, please? In case you don't know who it is John Norman MacLeod, Alistair Danter, and Dr. Donnie Munro. Gentlemen, thank you ever so much. Sorry we're a little bit late, but I think it was worthwhile hearing that extra 15 minutes or so from Professor Hunter, who's set out things expertly for us. Just for the record, if we could maybe go from left to right, who you are and who you represent, and anything by way of a short statement. Mr. MacLeod.
John Norman MacLeod. I'm Vice Principal and Director of Studies at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig UHI. Have been employed here since 1983, when Sabhal Mòr Ostaig started delivering programmes, full-time programmes through the medium of Gaelic.
Dr. Munro.
Donnie Munro, artist, musician, former rector of the University of Edinburgh and a former rector of the University of the Highlands and Islands, currently Director of Development, Fundraising and the Arts at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig.
Mr. Danter.
Alistair Danter. I work for Business Gateway Skye and Localsh. My background and training is in rural land management, land economy. I've lived and worked on Skye since 1998 in the area of rural development with the council primarily, latterly with Highland Opportunity and the Business Gateway. I have a croft and I have my own business.
Grateful. We're all here to hear Professor Hunter's evidence, and he was giving several solid reasons and a description and explanation about why there has been this population growth in the last 20, 30 years. I'd be very interested in your perspective in taking all this, and if there's anything that maybe Professor Hunter overlooked in terms of a number of reasons why this population is taking place. So we'll maybe just go one by one, if that's all right, and just to respond to what you've heard, and if there's anything that was maybe missed. Mr. MacLeod.
Yes. Well, it's very hard to follow Professor Hunter so eloquently gave the evidence, and I too have read his paper, so there's an awful lot there. I would very much agree with what Professor Hunter has said. I would agree certainly that that there have been the government intervention with the setting up of the Highlands and Islands Development Board has been very important, and in the last 50 years I think we would or could say yes very much that it has been a success story. The Highlands and Islands, the increase in population, I think 22% increase in the population of the Highlands and Islands, and so it's been very successful in that sense. Again, I would agree that certainly with the setting up of the University of the Highlands and Islands, it's it certainly offers great opportunities for all parts of the Highlands and Islands, and in fact it's very much a wider area even than the HIE area. But I would also agree that there are challenges. The increase in population, it's not universal in all areas. I think there are still areas of the Highlands and Islands which are suffering population decline. I think particularly Argyll and the Islands is one area, but also there have been huge increases in population like the Inner Moray Firth area, Shetland, and this particular sub-area as well of HIE, that's Skye, Lochulsh, Skye and Lochaber, Skye, Lochaber and Wester Ross, sorry. So there are a lot there. I think one thing I feel certainly that with the population there has been a drift, if you like, to the centres as well. So that causes problems in a lot of areas, because when you have a drift to the centre, then you also have services being provided more in the centre, and there's more pressure on services then. So some areas are quite deprived. But I feel population is something that is being looked at, very much being addressed, and I would very much agree with the final point she was making about devolved powers to communities. I think that is so important. And maybe one final thing, I am a director or trustee of Slate Community Trust, so I'm very much aware as well that at local it's so important to have that involvement in community and democracy right down to community level.
Thank you. Dr. Munro.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that clearly the evidence that we've just heard from Professor Hunter is very important, and not least it's correct, I think, to reflect on his own contribution directly, to be perfectly honest, as a historian and a writer, to raising issues and to giving people access to real information, and particularly for generations of young Highland people to have had the contact with his work has been a really significant stimulus to building the confidence that Jim himself spoke about in the evidence. I would have said that of all of the discussions that we've had, and for most of what Jim spoke about in his evidence, it's really about capacity building. And capacity building is a critical part of what has happened with this institution in this environment. And it covers a whole range of areas. It can't be tied down just to one aspect, whether it's education. I think it has to be something that's approached from a completely holistic way of working, looking at the community, energizing the community by creating opportunity. Now, it's interesting that part of our discussions have already alluded to the fact that the kind of centralizing agenda that has perhaps been the case over time is still problematic. And in actual fact, there are very clear reasons, and there were moves at one time to create the opportunity of actually taking out specific bodies of government, agencies of government, into areas like this, or into areas within rural Scotland. And there are very clear logical reasons why that should actually happen, rather than why these bodies should be centralised. And I think that doing that, with the likes of National Heritage or the Forestry Commission, all of these bodies that are dealing in aspects of the rural economy, the development of rural areas, and particularly economically fragile areas, that in itself would make an enormous difference to building capacity in the areas where we see economic problems. So I think generally the catchword would have to be, for me, the opportunity to capacity build, to make this whole sense of people having a sense of belief in themselves. And as we've heard from the evidence this morning, that is something that's filtered through many, many generations of people in this area. But it is changing. And with regards to the use of Gaelic language and culture and the wider material culture associated with the language, whether it's the arts or other areas associated, what is becoming quite apparent is an attitudinal shift amongst young people now currently seeing Gaelic language and culture as actually being something that's based around opportunity rather than something that was seen and perceived as negative. There are actually now positive benefits to being educated bilingually, to becoming qualified bilingually, and to seeing the fact that you are actually dealing with a language that's contributing in a very vibrant way to a modern society.
And Mr. Dancer, I'm interested in your views on this, but perhaps you could also just speak a little bit if there's anything that you've observed or detected. That, I mean, has this population growth that we've seen, has it had any impact on demand or provision of services to cater for a larger population? And maybe you're in a position to help us with that particular
I think
issue.
there are a couple of things, if I could just
Yes,
say
of
just
course.
before that, is that there has been a growth in population, but the structure of it is changing, and I think that should give rise for concern. It's a much older population, certainly than the rest of Scotland, and if we look at the demographic profile, the number of young people, the number of high school enrolments has gone down, and projecting that forward, that is certainly a matter for concern. Yes, there are pockets of where the population has grown, and Skye is one of them. My colleague that does the same work as me, but in Sutherland, Sutherland has a population density of something like 2 people per square kilometre. That is 3 less than the West African state of Mali, which is 2/3 Sahara Desert. Economic development in this environment is certainly challenging. If you sort of go on from that, then there are other impacts. Yes, there are people coming in, which is great. If you like, the type of finance that they come with is very different.
Just on that, just because it's an important point, so we don't lose this. I mean, if we are seeing a range of different population issues, growth in some areas, perhaps not so much depopulation, but still underpopulation, as you mentioned, the Sutherland example. Is there any reason why that should be spread across the Highlands like this? Is there anything that parts of the Highlands are doing and other parts aren't, for example, that could maybe increase that population?
I think it's a lot of what happens is due to where we are in the world, on the edge of Scotland, on the edge of Europe. Geographically, that sort of does set things, and so obviously the north of Sutherland, Skye, there is a difference.
But it is arguable it's easier to get to Sutherland than it is to get to Skye, as Mr. Law and myself found out yesterday, travelling 4 hours up.
So certainly that's the case. I think there's a mixture of sort of historical reasons. There's a mixture of the small businesses that have developed, and the specific sectors that they come from. Obviously, tourism is a massive industry for us here. It is a challenge to run a small hotel, I think, anywhere, should we say, on the west coast of Scotland. I would say it's doubly difficult in Sutherland than is on Skye. And you can see that in things like the number of times that a hotel will change hands. In Skye, I would say that's probably going down. They're staying in ownership for longer periods of time now than maybe 10 years ago. In Sutherland, I think you'll find certain hotels will be changing hands every 2 or 3 years. That's a small side of things.
I still look at an answer to my question, and I'll leave it up to the other guests to help out. Does this have an impact on demand for services, and is there a sense that there has to be a longer term plan and look at the provision of services if there is a growing population, particularly in areas like Skye and other parts of the Highlands? I don't know if anybody wants to pick that one up.
I think there's no doubt that many people would have very strong views about services, and certainly when you're talking about dispersed communities, communication and transport infrastructure is absolutely vital. It's probably fair to argue that going back historically, that the Highlands and Islands may well have been better served, in the 1940s and 1930s in terms of an integrated transport service or structure than they are now currently. There were more services which were integrated that serviced communities. So I think that's an issue that remains very high on the agenda for people in these areas. And in Skye in particular, the issue of the ferry services that are current in the south end here, but also the long-running discussion and demand and desire for an air service. It just is absolutely unbelievable that there is not an air service into Skye. I can think of virtually no other European island, you know, of this size and population that would not be served by an air service. And I think that would be something that would be a catalyst, you know, for the further regeneration of the area, very much so.
I'm grateful. Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Chair. The Highlands and Islands have a higher proportion of older people than the rest of Scotland. Scotland's an ageing population, as we know, compared to other parts of the UK, but the Highlands and Islands have this higher proportion. What implications do you feel that that has for the communities like Skye?
It's, I would say it's a mix. It's certainly on the sort of, if you like, on the social services. There is a sort of pressure there. I think there are potential implications there in sort of business startups. People generally aren't looking to start up a business or become economically seriously active once they're sort of older. They're looking for different types of employment if they do, say, move here or later on in life.
Yeah. Well, it's not only in Skye. I think the Western Isles also are very aware of this, a higher aging population, and I think it's certainly an issue, as I was saying, that maybe some of the services are more centralised. They may be in Stornoway or maybe in the more populated parts of islands and so on. There are issues as well, particularly in this area, say, of 24-hour medical care. There are particular issues if you're an island off an island. I'm just thinking of Razi, for example. So these issues are very pertinent in relation to provision for the elderly in that sense.
I think, you know, similar to other areas, the demographics may be different, but you know what has to happen in the Highlands and Islands area is that we have to create a situation where we have an enterprise culture where opportunity is there for young people and for working age people to successfully relocate to live in these communities, because in many ways the people coming to live in this part of the world, the requirements are no different really from people living anywhere. Essentially, there are opportunities for employment, opportunities for good housing, opportunities for education, and a decent transport and communication network. So, you know, the problems are the same, the solutions are different, but we need to see a development where you're bringing opportunity into these areas. It's quite interesting, if I may just add slightly on that point, that when you're talking about demand, perhaps you're talking about demand on services, but quite often development in the Highlands and Islands has been seen through the prism of civil servants sitting in Edinburgh, looking at a project or an idea and saying, well, where is the evidence of demand? Well, actually, if these kinds of developments and if this kind of place had been dependent on an evidence of demand, it simply would never have existed. And I have certainly seen experience where we have presented a project on the island of Islay as the sister campus to this place here. And on the basis of the attitude in terms of trying to decide and make a decision of should you be doing this or not, if it had been demand driven purely, you would have been erecting a porta-cabin somewhere rather than a centre for community and learning.
I mean, this committee is particularly interested in what you raise as the dependency ratio, the shrinking working age population vis-a-vis an ageing population, and the challenges that Scotland has, which is that we've got a bigger dependency ratio than the rest of the UK and the rest of the EU, and one of the things that we're looking at is how to address this, and perhaps one of the ways to do that is the growth of businesses, and it's just the SMEs and small businesses in the Highlands and Islands area, and perhaps you could help us just by talking about how important these are to the local area, and if there's perhaps anything that differentiate the way that SMEs and small businesses operate in the Highlands, which is different to the rest of Scotland.
Perhaps I could
Mr.
just
Doctor,
kick
yeah.
off with something we need breeding pairs, okay?
Yeah.
If you can tell people we need breeding pairs, please.
I don't think it's our job to tell them that, but maybe we can have a look at some of the reasons that can pull factors towards it.
Okay, as far as small businesses are absolutely vital. the challenges that they face here is that they are seen from, so we say, banking perspective as high risk. Small businesses are seen as high risk because it's usually just one or two people running them. They're taking all the decisions, doing all the work. They may not have financial acumen. So they are seen as high risk. Accessing finance is quite difficult for them. Very often, the amount of finance they need is relatively small. Because of banking conglomeration, we essentially have sort of five banks in the UK, and they're all pretty similar. And their attitude to SMEs and the people sort of wanting very small amounts of money, which is really all they need, is that they're high risk and they're a problem, and they actually cost a lot to run and service. And so they're dealt with in a way that is not that satisfactory. A lot of it is done over the telephone. For a business to have a face-to-face meeting with their bank manager in the Highlands and Islands is very difficult, unless they're if they want £50,000 and upwards, or maybe 100,000, then they can get to see someone. If they just want 5 or 10, it's got to be done over the telephone, and that's not very satisfactory. Very often, those businesses also, they're in, say, startup phase, and they need more support, need more capacity building, which costs to give it to them. But that certainly is the work that I do, and that's the work that I see.
Any other views, Dr. Munro?
I think SMEs are extremely important to an area like this, and again it goes back to issues of connectability, etc. Because to have that facility of being connected to the world market, being able to relocate or to locate to an area like this, in many ways, depending on your activity, it actually doesn't matter a great deal where you're located, providing you have access to your market, and that's increasingly becoming the case through IT and through good connectivity. But again, going back to the earlier point that Dr. Hunter made in his remarks with regards to more autonomy in the regions, it's certainly the case that the problems that you're raising there, that Alistair has just raised with regard to decision making, of looking at a small company in an area, if that had been dealt with at a local level in the former structures, for example, with the local enterprise companies, there's just a greater sense and a greater understanding of the regional requirements and the background and the context that these SMEs are operating in, and the likelihood is that you have far better outcomes in terms of decision making in areas of finance and a willingness to invest.
Yeah, I want to ask a little more about the business side, in particular what types of businesses are here in Skye and the surrounding areas, and how do they differ from the mainland, and also in the startups are people who've been living here for a long time, or is it people coming here to live, to change their lifestyle, or to start a business here?
Start with the sort of the sectors. The main sectors are tourism, which in itself could be very broad. That could be accommodation provision. It could be an outdoor activity provider. It's the major section. Creative industries is hugely important and growing. And again, that can be musicians, it can be jewelers, it can be potters, it can be textile workers. I mean, there is a huge growth in that sort of sector. Food production is another important area, growing importance, food and drink. What was interesting in a survey we conducted a couple of years ago is those different sectors have different challenges. Certainly for the food and drink, the issue was very much to do with transport, whereas to do with the tourism section was much more sort of finance was more of an issue. So within sectors there are problems. Obviously the most important primary production is agriculture and fisheries. Agriculture, we suffer because we don't have an abattoir on the island. If that was possible, I think the amount of agricultural production you would see would increase. If you're in the north of Skye, you've possibly, if you're taking a beast to market, you've probably got 4.5 hours to get to Dingwall, or you could go on the ferry and go over to Lochmaddy, which is another way of seeing things. Those are the sort of sectors that are certainly important. Sorry, I should say IT and software, and in the sort of crofts in the hills, you've got sort of whiz kids hidden away doing extraordinary things. But in terms of who's doing it, I would say it's across the board. It's a mixture of folk that have been born and bred here and have stayed, people that have gone away and come back, and also people that have moved in. So I would say the sort of the people that I see are, you know, a very, very wide range of people.
And the question really to follow up from that is there challenges for these businesses to retain or indeed attract talent here? And is it also a problem for Sabhal Mòr Ostaig as well?
Well, I would like to start. In our presentation we showed as well the importance of Sabhal Mòr Ostaig as an employer, third largest employer in the area. And I think it's so important that young people have that opportunity to study in the area, to remain in the area. For Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, we have been able to attract people as well out with the area. So we attract, particularly on the academic side, we are able to attract lecturers from throughout Scotland and internationally as well, from America. It's quite interesting actually what you find in the college. And I think again here the creative industries are particularly important. So the college is not just a centre for education, research and so on as a partner of UHI, but also is important for various projects, for businesses, startups in some ways as well, because we're providing opportunities in the area, business incubation as well. This particular building we're in is the Centre for Creative and Cultural Industries. There's a lot of activity here in relation to the media. There's also we mentioned MG Alapa as being important as well for input to the Gaelic media. There's also the Gaelic soap Famine, which is being filmed in this particular area, so that and is centred round about the college. So that brings more employment, more money into the area. So there are challenges like everything else, but the college has certainly been successful in attracting new talent, if you like, and keeping people in the area. I think maybe one point that Jim said, Dr. James Hunter said, as James Hunter said about the University of the Highlands, and people maybe young people still want to maybe leave, but there is a choice now. There was no choice when I was growing up in Skye. So the only choice, if you wanted higher education, you had to leave the island. Now there is a choice, and a lot of people maybe go away, but they also return. So there is that opportunity for them now.
Okay. Could I add a couple of things I think are important? The Highland Council has a graduate employment grant programme every year. We're funding for 25 graduates. It is quite often very difficult to recruit graduates for some of the positions that businesses want. So businesses do want to expand. They've identified a need and work that a graduate could do, but it's often quite difficult to recruit them. That is proving a problem. Linked to that, even if recruitment is possible, there is a problem with accommodation in the area. Some communities have a very high percentage of secondary or holiday homes in there, which is a kind of double-edged sword. I was doing some work recently with someone from Carbost and Mingonish. 25% of the houses in that community are secondary sort of holiday homes. So that's a real problem. My own community, which is Edinbane in the northwest, we recently carried out a sort of housing survey, talking to the business sector. All of the businesses there wanted to expand and develop, and had a sort of, they were being pushed that way and were happy to do it. Their major challenge was actually accommodation for staff working for them. The biggest employer was a fish farm, something like 18 employees, and less than 50% of those lived within 5-mile capacity. It all had to come a lot further.
Thank you. We did an inquiry not so long ago with the Scottish Affairs into post-study work visas. We found that businesses were having difficulties recruiting international graduates because of the wage requirements for the Tier 2 visas, work visas. Do you have problems here in filling graduate vacancies as a result?
Well, I wouldn't say that we've had problems here. I think that there are issues, certainly. I think within Scotland, within the sector in Scotland, Scottish universities are very much aware of this. UHI is also very much aware of this issue as well. And I think because of this issue, numbers are falling as well, applicants to courses, I think in Scotland, particularly from students from India, and also within UHI, there have been a drop of inquiries for courses here at UHI as well. So it's anti-competitive in a lot of ways, and these students are obviously going to go elsewhere. And for example, they
Have you just on that point, so don't lose it? Have you got evidence that's suggesting because of like a post-study work group that this is an impact on your student numbers? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, certainly within UHI there are figures there that I think it was students from Nepal. There was a decrease. I think there were maybe 27, and then it's down to about single figures or round about that. And I think in Scotland as well, certainly with students from India, there has been a decrease. But the other factor is in a lot of overseas degrees, internship is important as well to have that work experience. So again, they're missing out. Students will miss out on that if they don't have the post-study visa and the opportunity to work. So it is something, and again, you're missing out on the skills of these students. They're being educated here, but they're not being able to remain here to work and to add their skills, particularly in rural areas. I think there are skill shortages. So I would say there is very much a disadvantage, and I think it's something that UHI is aware of. It is also something the Scottish universities are very much aware of and would like to see a change there.
I've just got a last question around high-speed internet. I know I was speaking last night up in Portree to the hotels who are struggling to get Wi-Fi and hearing that fibre optic is finally coming here. How important is it for here in this college, the importance of high-speed internet, both in terms of attracting students and also in terms of teaching, particularly distance learning, for example?
Yes, it's vitally important. It's vitally important for education. It's vitally important to live here, to work here, for businesses and so on. UHI is a European leader in VC, video conferencing, and distance delivery. It's the same with the college here. It gives you that connectivity. We are aware of the Digital Highlands and Islands, HIEs, and it's funded through Scottish Government as well, and UK Government. But there are particular issues here in Skye, because I think that was rolled out more from the centre, and then there are certain parts of Skye which will not benefit from that. Certain areas will not benefit. There's also an issue about being near the exchange. I think it's, if you're between 1 and 2 kilometres from an exchange, you won't have the benefit of the strong signal. I think one development which is quite important, I think, is the community broadband, and that is being provided in areas like this. I did mention that it was on Slate Community Trust. We provide Skynet, which is linked to community broadband, rural broadband, to areas here in this peninsula which may not get broadband or may not get sufficiently fast. So it's about accessibility. It's also about the level of connectivity.
I'm trying to summarise what we've heard from both Professor Hunter and from our three distinguished guests just now, and I'm trying to look at the issues which and the challenges that are things that might be that need to be overcome to ensure that we do continue to repopulate the Highlands? And my list here is local decision making, housing, transport infrastructure and access to broadband. Would you say that these were the key levers that you would need in order to try and continue to grow the population of the Highlands, or have we missed something, or is there any ranking of these particular issues I've picked up? We'll maybe start with you, Dr. Munro.
I think these are all, absolutely critical, and just to add to that list is the relocation of specific agencies of government to areas where it makes sense to locate them, and that would really make a big difference too. But all of these are key to future development.
Have we missed anything, Mr. Danter?
I would just add to that list finance and whether it's local banking, whether it's local enterprise trusts. That sort of local finance is so important, and the big difference between ourselves and Europe, as I say, that we've got these sort of centralised banks. Whereas in Europe they have the centralised banks and they have the local banks, and the local banks have a very clear sort of remit to serve the local business population.
Just lastly from me, and Margaret Ferrer's got one more question, if there was one thing that you would want government, whether that be of a Westminster variety or Scottish, to assist you in order to try and ensure that we continue to have population growth in the Highlands, what would that be? And we always like the on-the-spot questions in this committee, so we'll go with each of you with that one, and we'll start with you, Mr. MacLeod.
Well, I would say it's this distinctive answers to distinctive problems. It is about this devolved powers, more autonomy. I mean, in the islands there is this development, our islands, our futures, and I think it is about that. But the other thing I felt very encouraging in looking at this is the attitude of young people, and there has been a survey by HIE looking at young people in the area and out with the area as well, and it shows that young people have that confidence, and I think that's a confidence that Professor Hunter was talking about, that to remain, to study here, they see it as a good area, they identify with their own communities, and that is particularly strong in Shetland, Orkney and other areas as well, but it is about our future, and the young people are very much our future.
Dr. Munro? Yes.
Well, I think given the cataclysmic events of the last
we're coming to that one.
couple of weeks, then certainly one of the areas in relation to central government, to both Westminster and the devolved government, is to recognise how critical the European funding programmes have been, as Dr. Hunter said earlier, not just to the capital infrastructure but to some of the social programmes through ESF funding, etc. And I think that it's vital that these areas, that as early in the process as possible, there is an absolute undertaking to ensure that the gap in funding that may emerge because of this change will be met.
Now you bring that up, I know Margaret Ferry was very keen to ask a question on this, so we'll maybe bring Margaret in just now and we could follow that up.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, coming back to the EU referendum result, the UK's future immigration system is unclear now. Policies, we don't know what they will look like in the future, and I was interested looking at some of the evidence that superfast broadband within Scotland, there was 20.5 million EU funding going to be coming to help with the funding of superfast broadband. So we're not going to be sure now whether that 20.5 million, and that's just one example of funding. So how do you feel could the Brexit affect the future population of the Highlands and Islands?
I feel very strongly that if the inward investment that has been witnessed over the years coming from Europe is not maintained in some shape or form, that it will have a really detrimental effect on future development. I've been involved with Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, very, very happily involved here in development since '97, and I cannot think of one single development, this development we're currently in at the moment included. All of the capital programmes have been substantially funded through European funding. But I think wider than that, I think it's an attitudinal issue as well, because the one thing that we have enjoyed is a relationship with European communities, and with particularly European areas of minority language. You know, there's been a common cause there between different regions, and part of what Sabhal Mòr has done has been working in partnership with these communities. And I think particularly the European Union has recognised the importance, for example, of looking at Ireland and the Northern Ireland and the Republic, seeing language as an area of common cause, seeing language as a way of crossing barriers that historically have been erected between communities. But by going through that, developing that process of looking at common culture, that has been a significant part of the history of development of the language between Ireland and Scotland.
Anybody else want to make a contribution on that?
Yes, I would agree with what Donny has said. I think we should be building bridges instead of putting up barriers. And we've benefited not only from structural funds in roads and a lot of projects, they wouldn't happen had it not been for European funding, but we've benefited in other ways as well, environmentally and so on, and culturally, and made a lot of connections. And I think it's very much a period of uncertainty, and it would be good to have reassurances of the way forward, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up the point earlier about the post-study work visa route, that it's not just about giving back economically to the country or the place that you've studied in, but there's the cultural and the social benefits that you get from overseas students coming here. And I believe that one of the key issues as well for young people to come to this area was cited as the broadband issue, and I think all of us have been slightly frustrated while we've been here that we haven't been able to go on Twitter and tweet what we're doing, and that's been very frustrating. So there's sort of wider consequences to the Brexit, I believe, which will all become apparent in time, I hope.
Indeed.
Could I just add, I mean, I would endorse what my two colleagues have said. I think particularly for the tourism sector, it's a matter of concern, both in terms of who's working in it and the fact that many people from Europe come and work here. I mean, you've got to be visiting one of the foodiest islands, I think, on the west coast at the moment, and if you talk to any sort of restaurateur, they would tell you how great it is being able to sort of pull in people from different cultures and how it makes their product just their offer is just increasing. And if we lose that, you know, that will have an impact. If people cannot come, because I mean, historically, one of the problems for the tourism industry is that being in service is not seen as a great future, whereas in Europe people have a very different attitude to that. If we lose those people, we will suffer. And many do come here to work and settle and start their lives in business.
I'm very grateful to all. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of time again, and a fascinating session, and we're very, very grateful. I'll just say the last time I shared a stage with Dr. Monroe was going back about 20 years ago, and I think there was a request from my colleagues to do a duet, which I think we've managed to resist. So far. And yes, but we're very, very grateful to you for it. And again, like to all our guests at these committees, if anything we've missed, anything you observe in the course of this inquiry, please get back in touch with the committee again with any further written evidence. But thank you ever so much for attending today. If we could have the next panel, please. That's absolutely fine. If you're all ready, we'll maybe just get started. Is that okay?
Yep.
Right, what we'll do, and just for our records, if you just say who you are, what organisation you represent, and anything by way of a very short introductory statement. And we'll start with you, Ms. Hannah.
Okay, I'm Monica Hannah from Skye Space, Citizens Advice Bureau.
Ms. Mackenzie.
I'm Sandra Mackenzie from FASCA, the Skye Space Mental Health Association, where we provide a drop-in centre for people with mental health problems.
Grateful. Ms. Footet.
I'm Judy Footet from Advocacy Highland, and I coordinate the project here in Skye Space, and we provide independent issue-based advocacy across the Highlands.
Thank you. Dr. Gould.
Hi, I'm Caroline Gould. I'm Secretary and an Access Auditor at Skye and Lochailse Access Panel. I'm grateful for the invitation to be here today. The Chair of the Access Panel asked me to represent the Access Panel because I have several years' experience on the panel, and as a disabled person I have the experience of what it's like to be disabled living in Skye and trying to access services. And I just add we're a a group of local volunteers, including people with different disabilities, carers, and people with an interest in encouraging social inclusion and the creation of an accessible environment. We currently only have 7 members, 2 of whom are qualified access auditors who studied at Heriot-Watt University to gain that qualification, and I am one of the access auditors. We also provide a type of support advocacy service for people who can't gain access to services, and provide guidance to organisations and individuals within Skye and Lochalsh. We work closely with NHS Highland. We have a planning protocol with Highland Council. We advise on planning, building warrant applications, things like that, and lots more.
Great. Well, I'm very grateful to all of you, and we've got our first piece of literature presented today, and it's good to see an all-women panel after the last one being all male, so it's good to see that. Just now. Perhaps we could go one by one, and I'd be interested in all your views just about the particular services that you offer, and what we want to hear about is maybe the challenges and issues that you have serving in an island community, and your view how they may differ from services that may be provided in constituencies that we represent in central Scotland. And we'll maybe start with Ms Mackenzie this time, if that's all right.
The biggest challenge that we face at the minute is the lack of staff in the NHS service. So we're on our 5th locum psychiatrist at the moment in Skye Lochalsh, which isn't very good. But we supported 145 people with just 6 employees in 2014-15. The majority of our funding comes from the NHS Highland. And we support people in the way that where a lot of our people are single people who suffer from mental health problems, and we do what a family would normally do. And the difficulties for us are that there are no other services in the area. So where we differ from Glasgow, there's no choice. And same with Inverness, although they've got fewer services as time goes on. So, yeah.
Ms Fiddy.
I would echo what Sandra said. Our advocacy organisation mainly provides mental health advocacy, and part of what we do is to help people to try and get the best out of services and to help them get their voice heard, and to encourage the development of services to be built up around the carers' needs. And the actual lack of services on the ground is quite disheartening. People can be assessed, and they can have an assessed need, but unfortunately the services aren't available to provide that assessed need. And then that has a knock-on effect on people's well-being, because they're not receiving a service that maybe a policy would allow to build a proactive and systematic approach to service development and service delivery. In fact, it's got to be ad hoc, it's got to be reactionary. It has to wait until people are right at the end of their tether, really, before any services can be provided. So that does impact on people. And as far as older people are concerned, living in such a remote and rural place puts limitations on everybody. So I think that impacts higher on older people who maybe have problems with mobility. There's also the fact that a lot of older people come from out with the islands, so their family support services aren't there. So people like Sandra's organisation can fill that niche, but the kind of gap between services which would have provided those things and a family, well, they just don't exist anymore, so that leaves older people.
I want to look a little bit more with you and some of the demography issues and challenges we have, so we will come to that. Dr. Gould, maybe if you could give us your view just about what the specific challenges there may be in a Highland area.
Well, I would agree with everything so far said. One of the things I think is there's always an assumption that everyone has a telephone. That's not the case. Or a computer, or internet access, or a mobile phone, and as you will have discovered, there's no signal throughout a lot of the areas of the island. There's an assumption that everyone can read and write. This is not the case, and in a small community, people who can't don't want everyone else to know about it. So it's very difficult for them to actually achieve the help very often. there's an assumption that everyone has a helpful friend, neighbour or relative, and that is not the case either. But I would certainly say that personally I've had a lot of experience of having to travel far afield for services to actually get to a crisis point and the service not be available then to pick up. And it's echoed a lot. We also have to do things like, a disabled child enters a school, there are no plans for the school to have an accessible toilet. And we have to fight and fight and fight to get something like that even installed.
Grateful, yeah. Miss Anna, you anything to the peculiarities of Highlands and Island services?
If I can I just read a short statement?
Of course, please, yeah.
So
As long as it's short.
Short, which summarises statistical analysis from Skye Citizens Advice Bureau in 2015-16. So in the last year we had 5,712 individual client contacts in our area. From that 5,712, that generated over 12,000 actual issues, all requiring support and representation. 20% of that was debt-related issues. However, the majority of the work, at 48%, is benefit-related in our area. Looking at the older demographics, there's 3% of that in attendance allowance, pension credits, housing benefit, home visits, but the large majority of the benefit-related issues when they're broken down are the disability benefits, personal independence payment and ESA. The demographic of our clients in the year, 38% are aged 44 and under, 34% in the age bracket 45 to 59, and 27% are aged 60 plus, meaning that 72% were actually of working age. There's an equal split of male and female clients. 35% of our clients overall said they were unable to work due to long-term ill health or disability. To summarise, though, the majority of our client base is single, unemployed, either with unsecured tenancy, in debt arrears and or limited employment opportunities, with seasonal work in particular to this area. The total client financial gain for last year recorded with the Citizens Advice Bureau was £163,294. The majority of this is benefit related, and the reason for clients presenting to the Citizens Advice Service is the complexity of the claims process, unable to access hardware technology to complete the necessary digital forms. And it's also to note that 38% of these clients said they also had caring responsibilities.
Great, well, I'm grateful for that. I mean, one of the things that we're doing, and the major thrust of this inquiry is looking at the changing demography that we have in Scotland with an increasingly ageing population, and maybe the necessity to change public policy and perceptions just about how we address some of these issues. I just wonder if there's anything in particular, and we're grateful to you, Ms Anna, for giving us the breakdown of CAB contacts, but can maybe the rest of you start to talk a little bit about how have you had to re-alter, redesign the services that you provide because of an ageing population? And again, because we're here in the Highlands, if there's anything specific about the way the Highlands address some of these things, we'd be interested to hear that too. So we'll maybe start with you this time, Ms Footit, if that's all right.
We carry on increasing our capacity as an organisation. We've done training on stroke and dementia. We've done training on financial abuse and doorstep scam, things like that, because we recognise that those things impact a lot on older people. Organisationally, going forward, we're considering partnership with a cancer advocacy organisation for over 50s. At the moment, over 65s makes up just under a third of our referrals. So we do expect that to rise, but we expect it to rise in line with an overall rise in demand for the service. So we do have capacity at the moment, and we are looking to the future. But a lot of our work is specifically with older people. I'm thinking of things like the Adult Support and Protection Act, which impacts a lot on older people. So organisationally, our manager is part of a subgroup which looks after that. I think she's also part of a subgroup with the access panel as well, things like that. So we do have a mind and a view to going forward. And as far as being in the Highlands and Islands, it's the remoteness and rurality which affects most people kind of at the bottom of the pile, which again is going to impact more on an ageing population because of difficulties that we've talked about with social support and also with transport and mobility. And public transport is obviously a feature there. I came from Kyle today, but the earliest I would have been able to arrive here by public transport would have been 1:45, so I had to get a taxi. So if an old person has an early appointment, say in Broadford Hospital, and they live in Kyle, they're going to have to get a taxi. So it impacts financially as well as socially on people's health and well-being.
Grateful. Dr. Gould.
Recent statistics for Scotland as a whole have shown that between 2006 and 2031 the number of people aged 75 years and over is projected to increase by 81%. However, the number of people aged 75 years and over in Skye and Loch Alsh is projected to increase by 143.5%. So you can see, compared to the national average, we're much, much higher.
And in your view, just on that, do you think there's a preparation in place to accommodate this?
No,
or does
absolutely.
what you're observing is concern you? Obviously it does, you're shaking your head like that, yeah.
Very concerned, yes. And I've been attending meetings for 8 to 10 years where I have been continuing to bring this up. The Scottish Household Survey 2012 estimated 34% of households in Scotland contained at least one member with a disability or a long-term illness. However, in Highland region, the average is 39%. Furthermore, more than half the population aged 75 years or over would be considered disabled under the legal definition, under the original Disability Discrimination Act, and now under the Equality Act, though they may not consider themselves disabled, nor may they be seen as disabled by those who interact with them on a daily basis. And we have a growing population that is an ageing population who, at a meeting last week, I was told by somebody who was a retired nurse, she said, there are so many people that are disabled. I'm so glad your group exists because you're showing us people care. She said, my generation remember how disabled people were treated when we were younger, and we don't want to admit that we're disabled because it's a very negative word.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say the terminology is so negative that most people don't use it. I'm actually using the word disabled today, not because I think I'm disabled. It's society that is disabling me. I have a condition which could be classified as an impairment. But I don't think I've got anything wrong with me. This was the person I was meant to be genetically. It's society that is preventing me from doing things. And when I compare how things are for me 5 years on after using a wheelchair for 5 years, my world has collapsed, absolutely collapsed. I go out of the house maybe once every 10 days because there is nowhere to go except the co-op, and I can't even do my own shopping. But having said that, I mean, more people are beginning to realise that disabled people have rights and are requesting our services so much that, I mean, I work from home and I had 5 days off last year because the access panel's work was so enormous.
I mean, one of the things that we were reminded of when we were taking evidence in Edinburgh with some of the pensioners' organisations, we were raising the term dependency ratio, and they were correcting us to say that older people make a significant contribution to the economy, and they mentioned things like childcare, making sure that they were available to assist and help out, particularly in rural communities. And so we were always reminded about how we use language and just how, like the conversation about these issues should be conducted. So it's good of you to remind us of that, Dr. Gould, but maybe Ms Mackenzie, if you've got anything to add to just some of the issues that we're seeing about the change in demography.
And on the mental health side, the person's still going to continue to have their mental health problems. However, we will then maybe work more closely with other agencies like Alzheimer's Scotland, and because we see people for a great amount of time every day, we can notice little bits of change in people's health and be able to pass them on a little bit earlier. But with the age thing, it's really hard. I've got quite old parents, and neither of them see themselves as old, and they won't join into pensioners clubs and things because they don't feel that they're old. And so it's quite difficult, especially if people from the area don't see themselves in that kind of way. Yeah, so.
Great, thank you for that. Margaret Ferrier.
Yeah, just going back to the question that the chair has asked there about obviously the ageing population and changes that you expect to make to your services. Have you all prepared for these changes to come in? What kind of changes to your service do you think you'll need to bring in? Ms Mackenzie?
Well, we will continue to do what we do. The age of the person doesn't really matter so much, because we'll just try and get the funding to cope with that ageing. That will be a problem for us.
Anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, as I've said before, we're 7 and quite a lot of us are disabled and have major health issues. So we have to continue doing what we do. What would improve the way we can actually provide our services is if other service providers and other organisations, including the local authority, NHS Highland, worked better with us. And actually, instead of just having a tick box mentality that they've attended a meeting and listened to what we've said but can go home and ignore what we're advising and the guidance that we're giving, which is actually best practice guidance, British standards, how to make things accessible for disabled people. And I mean, we work with architects, we work with applicants, we work with a lot of people, and I have yet to find one person who has ever read this. So we are not getting things that we need. In small businesses around here, the tendency is to call in a builder or a joiner and say, I need a ramp, because apparently only disabled people use wheelchairs. There aren't any learning impairments, there aren't any hearing impairments, there aren't any visual impairments in their view. Well, that's not the case, but you'll get a ramp that is provided by a joiner that goes straight up, very sheer, far too dangerous, is likely to tip a wheelchair back. It has no landing at a door where you have to stop to pull the door open. So how can you use the wheelchair? I mean, or how can you use the ramp? It's just, we have an ageing population where, you know, we have planning saying a 1 in 12 ramp is all that's required, that's the minimum. But we're saying that research shows that we have an ageing population, and if an elderly spouse is a carer and pushing their spouse in a wheelchair, they can't manage anything other than a 1 in 20 ramp. And the same for people who propel themselves in wheelchairs. We have lots of venues around Skye. When you phone up, are you accessible? Yes, we are. You get there and you find you can't get in, or you injure yourself. I mean, we've had somebody injure themselves on us, losing control in a wheelchair on a ramp coming out of the building and hitting a wall. And we have an attitude still that, oh, we'll lift your wheelchair. Well, my wheelchair is 120 pounds without me in it, or 120 kilos without me in it. And when we have discussed this with the police, they now classify that as assault. And no insurance is going to cater for wheelchairs being lifted or anything like that. There's a very old-fashioned attitude and a complete and utter lack of knowledge as to what is required to make things accessible for people with a variety of different disabilities. And if people would work better with us, they would achieve a lot more.
Okay, that's probably bringing me into my next question then. How can central and local government policies support older people and people with impairment to become more involved in society, and what particular problems do you think that poses in rural areas when they come to you?
I would encourage that to be completely read, thoroughly digested, and all the actions that are requested actually take place. We have parts of the Equality Act that still aren't enacted yet.
What about yourself, Miss Pritchett?
I would think that. Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, just how can central and local government policies support older people and people with an impairment to become more involved in society? Okay. And what problems would that pose, particularly in rural areas
The lack of an integrated public transport system and the lack of social supports, the paring of services just to the bone, particularly for older people, has impacted on them and will continue to do so. Thinking about how an ageing population affects us all going forward, that's all of us. That means everyone in a job is going to be getting older, and because you're older and maybe not firm, as has already been pointed out, that doesn't mean to say that you don't perform your other functions as well. So you may be a carer, you may be, even if you're retired, you may be a worker. Quite a few of our volunteers are older people. So as an organisation, part of the way that we deal with people is to recognise equality. So if people need more support to actually bring their equality levels up to the level of, say, a younger person without impairment, then any policy should really be looking towards all of the activities and all the functions that older people as an increasing proportion of our population already perform, and we're already relying on them. So any funding for older people also shouldn't, thinking about the way that the language that we use and the conversations that we have, it shouldn't necessarily be thinking of a frail older person as just somebody who needs services given to them. How do we start conversations that tap into that knowledge? Older people are what helps to stick society together. Kids learning at their granny's knees about song and story and tradition, and starting up conversation groups of people, say, with dementia. There's been a lot of co-working with the schools and dementia, which has social benefits, but it's younger people benefiting from this resource, which is older people.
Thank you. Ms. Hannah?
Just going back to an earlier point, we're actually seeing an increase of the older clients who are actually owner-occupiers, who can no longer effectively afford to heat the full part of their homes, so they're kind of self-living in one or two parts of the home instead of the full home. And that's something that's really changed over the last year. Of course, we've got lack of mains gas, we've got no access to dual fuel deals for clients. The majority of the older population that we've seen out in our home visits have actually benefited from the Croft House grant scheme, which maybe 20, 30 years ago. And then because of the situation they're in now, they're no longer able to afford to maintain the properties and keep the upkeep of it and keep it warm and so on. And it's whether or not there's a facility there for because at the time when they were able to, they were crofters and able to apply for these certain schemes, but you're going back 20, 30 years ago. They're now in the ageing population group and they're no longer crofters, so they can no longer access the crofters grants to keep to get the repairs done.
I mean, one of the things that surprised us when we visited Orkney was just the levels of fuel poverty, and it surprised us because it's renewable rich and it's able to supply most of its own energy requirements. Is there an issue with fuel poverty just now, and is it having a particular impact on older people?
Definitely, not just older people. There certainly is in relation to fuel poverty. I mean, we don't have the healthy competition, I don't think, and I think people are very reluctant to switch to alternative suppliers. There's a real fear of doing that without support.
They don't have access to internet, and even if they did have access to internet, they wouldn't know even where to begin doing that. And that's another issue. I know they spoke about it earlier on.
The broadband.
And if there was Wi-Fi available, we as workers would be able to take equipment into people's homes and do things with them, whereas we can't at the minute because
I can see Dr. Gould's keen to come in there.
Yeah, another something I've only recently come across myself even is, when you need adaptations to your home, you're required to make an application form for assistance with the adaptations, and you need 3 quotes. But if you can't get those 3 quotes, everything stops, it seems. and you cannot get those quotes because the people, electricians, plumbers, builders, joiners, have so much work that, you know, it's taking time away from that to come to somebody to give a quote when they know they might not get the job. You know, and months down the line, people still can't get a quote, so they can't get the modifications they need to their home, which is a false cost because they require more care until they get those modifications to their home.
Yep.
Okay, my next question again is about, obviously, life expectancy is increasing now, and as people live longer, then they're going to become more dependent on public services. So what's your experience of the health and social care needs of the ageing population in the Highlands and Islands? Who would like to start with that? Let's put it.
I think that what services there are good. That's one of the strengths of the island community, that what professionals are in post are known, that it's already been shown that there's a lot of posts being going unfilled, like locum psychiatrists. I think this fella is still locum, isn't he? Yes. So we still don't have permanent psychiatrists. So what services there are, we kind of tend to know each other. So I think we know what services are available, and we also know how to access them. So us as professionals, we would be helping people to actually access what services there are. However, then the problem comes with what funding is available for those services to spend. Because I know people who have been assessed for need, for example, an older lady who uses a wheelchair, who has her own health problems as well as mobility problems, who's a carer for her son who's in his 40s, who has mental health and other health problems. And she has had a social assessment, and she obviously has care needs, but they can't offer her a service at the moment. So that is just because, you know, the services are just stretched so thin. She's got to go onto a waiting list, and there's a hierarchy of need. And obviously, you know, in a time of austerity, we're now carrying on reaping an effect from 2008, and it's carried on impacting on us. As far as services joined up, when the idea of integrated health and social care started being rolled out in Skye first, and we were on, there was a local implementation group because there was an actual plan for integrated health and social care. So all of the involved professionals and voluntary groups were part of this group. We moved through the stages from proposal to implementation, and everything was done, so it was actually implemented. But we weren't able to move forward as a group then, because that's when the funding stopped. All of the social cohesion and all of the networking, the understanding of what was happening, we could spot issues and trends as they arose. We could talk about them with each other. We could actually plan and really be proactive in planning these services. We tried to do it ourselves, just as a group, on our own time, but it started to impact too much on our work because someone would have to take notes, someone would have to type it, and quite apart from having somewhere to meet. So having gone from a very well planned and very well implemented group that would have had value in continuing a proper joining up of health and social care, I'm afraid that went. And now what it actually means is integrated health and social care means NHS are the bosses, NHS has a fixed budget, and we can't vote for councillors who might make a difference at Highland Council level. So I think that shows to your committee that policy is paramount. Policy must be very carefully phrased and written to take account of all of this, because the actual accountability is taken away from local government and given to a large body. I know that health is a devolved matter, so as far as devolution is concerned, that will be something to consider for the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you. Okay. Crystal.
It's quite a direct question, really. Judy, yourself, you brought one of the services is difficult to access. Is that an integrated public transport?
Yeah.
And the key one has been the health services. Can you expand a little bit on transport and what other services are difficult to access on these islands?
Sandra's services are marvellous, drop-in and social support in Portree. So if you live in Portree, that's fine. If you live in Kyle, that isn't fine. It means that if you took a bus up, you would probably have 2 hours before you could turn around and get the bus back. So there's things like, and things like the CAB. Morag, you do an outreach one day a week, subject to funding.
We've actually got two outreaches.
Outreaches. So on 2 days a week in Kyle, oh that's right, there's one in Broadford, is that right?
Yeah.
So Portree, Kyle and Broadford, there's an outreach, but anywhere else is kind of inaccessible.
We also have an outreach in
Oh, you have an outreach, that's right, you have an outreach as well, yeah.
South End and Loch Alsh.
Yes.
It's just 1 day a week for us.
Yes.
A very social outreach for them.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a resource centre in Portree which helps people with learning disabilities and also some older people. So that isn't accessible, that's the only centre, so that isn't accessible. You don't have that. The hospitals as well, one in Broadford, one in Portree.
And you also raised internet being a difficult to get access to here, and in some places there's none at all. Is that correct?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
I was just saying that also difficulty getting access to the internet.
Yeah.
And
I mean, our members live across the whole of Skye and Loch Alsh, and if I want to email them a 3-page Word document, the majority of them can't actually download the attached file because their broadband is so poor. Here in Slate last week there was an outage of broadband, certainly across one whole village and other parts of Slate for several days. And up in the Carbust area 2 weeks ago we had exactly the same thing. So you can actually be emailing something and somebody and they never actually receive the email at all because they can't get on the internet. But of other things that I was going to say, that I mean, wheelchair services is something that's not based on the island here for disabled people. And also we have Motability. Now everybody who pays for their vehicle through Motability, they pay the same as everybody else. They expect the same service as everybody else, but they don't get it here. The RAC, which is the breakdown cover they pay for, doesn't come to the island. What happens is somebody will be subcontracted to take their vehicle away from them, and they have no idea when they will get it back. And they're told by Motability within 2 days you'll have a replacement vehicle. Well, I've never known Motability achieve that in under 3 weeks. So what you're supposed to do, if you live somewhere like a road that's full of potholes and that's the sort of thing that you have to go through every day when you can't use your vehicle, and you've got a limited battery which has to go up and downhill a lot. It means you maybe get a mile, if you're lucky, out of your battery instead of the 10 miles you're told you get. So I don't believe that some of the things are fit for purpose around here that we're being provided with. But you cannot afford, when you can't get on a bus, you can't. If you have your vehicle, you can't get the train to Inverness because it's nothing to do with the train station or the train being inaccessible. They're great. You just can't park close enough. There is no disabled parking. You can't walk 700 metres to get to the train. You know, and if you use a power-assisted wheelchair, if you do that 700 metres, that's 700 metres less you have in Inverness, and you've got to make sure you've got enough battery to get back to your vehicle when you come home. But also we have problems that we have such an ageing population, and we have very little in the way of on-street disabled parking bays in Skye, very little. And when the access panel have been asked to contact the police to complain about abuse of parking without a badge in disabled bays, what we've been told is that they haven't been marked appropriately, they haven't been signed appropriately, therefore the law cannot be enforced. So what's the point in providing the few that we have? But people, when they shop, can't buy everything they want in one shop. physically have to move around a village, and if you can't get parked, and particularly in a season like the tourist season, you know, you could have travelled 30 miles to get something, and you can't get parked. And I have known it myself, having to wait up to 1.5 hours just to get parked in a co-op car park.
Thank you.
We're coming quite close to the end of the session, and we're really, really grateful for all your evidence. So just one thing, and I just want to pick it up a little bit from what Ms. Footit said. I can't see your name beyond all those walks, and it was about the integration of healthcare and social work and local government, and you obviously, in your own experience, about the concerns about local accountability and access to democracy. I mean, we've not got much time left. I just like the views of maybe the other panels, just if there's a sense that, you know, I mean, the package that's been designed by Scottish Government in terms of, you know, the combination of healthcare and social workers, how's it been, and is there any particular island issues with it that you've identified?
Just say that this is a recent review of respite and short break provision for adult carers of adults in the Highland Partnership area. There is absolutely no intention shown in this, even though someone in it mentions there's a tsunami of dementia on the way and lots of other equally frightening comments.
Yep.
There is no intention, it would appear, to increase space, respite space in Skye and Lochailsh and South West Ross.
Yep.
Now, my personal experience 3 weeks ago, my husband needed to go into hospital. He'd been told for 3 weeks, you need to go into hospital, you are very ill. He kept saying, I can't. I'm a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week carer for my wife. She needs a care package put in place. He was told every day, and he was going 7 days a week for treatment. He was told every day for those 3 weeks, don't worry, we'll sort that out. Eventually, he came home with a message that if I collapse, you have to press your red emergency button and call for an ambulance. At which point, I thought, well, I'm going to start asking where this care package is.
Yep.
Nobody had told them.
Okay.
And in the end, he was taken into hospital and I was abandoned.
Yeah.
Or the alternative was for me to go into a care home, which my wheelchair can't fit into the rooms in, or another care home 80 miles away, when I was also being told I needed to be at his side at the hospital to learn how to do his treatment.
Grateful. Have you got a view, on the left-hand side, got a view about social care, health care mergers and the plans for it?
I think that it's taken a wee while to bed in, and I think that
Skye and Lochailsh was a trial area for this, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that there's little bits that were lost because children and families has been kind of taken in a different direction. So where it was a bit more of a rounded service, there's kind of two different pots there now. But I get the point where we have had situations where people have been sent home and provision hasn't been ready for them on their arrival, or nobody knows they're coming home. So there's little teething problems like that they could do with, especially from Inverness to Skye.
Rosanna, have you got any views at all?
No, just, I mean, through our monthly kind of staff feedback discussions, what we're finding people is the actual clients in Skye and Lochailsh now are having difficulty just getting the actual travel to their local GP surgery. So yes, it's the travel to the consultants at Belford and Inverness Hospital, but it's even just locally, 10 miles up the road, and the affordability and the transport wise.
Well,
and those that have to go further afield, even possibly London for treatment. I'm aware of somebody who has already spent in excess of £50,000 travelling to where they need to get their treatment, because although the NHS is free at the point of delivery, it's not free to get there, and what you can claim back, they've had to spend so much more and have had to actually consider giving up on the treatment now.
Well, we're very grateful for your evidence, and again, it's such a range of services, and we're obviously sense that Skye is well provided for when you've been here today, so we're really grateful. If there's anything else that you felt that we've missed, anything else you want to add to this inquiry, again, as always, we're always open for further written evidence, so please get in touch again. But thank you very much for attending this afternoon. And if we could have the next panel, please, which is Mr. Blackford and Mr. Brain. And Mrs. Brain. Right, thank you very much, and we're very grateful to both you, Mr. and Mrs. Brain, and Mr. Blackford, for agreeing to this session at short notice. I think it was important to hear your story, given just how extensively it's been reported in the course of the past few weeks. And maybe just a brief summary of, first of all, tell us who you are, and just for a record, if you can, and then perhaps just a summary of where we are and what has happened in terms of your own particular case.
I think a brief summary would be impossible in dealings with the Home Office. Our situation is that we came over here, and this is very brief, came over here in 2001 on a belated honeymoon, fell in love with the country, the Highlands particularly. Came over in 2005 with the holidaymaker's glasses off to see if we could make a stay over here, work logistically. So we were looking at cost of living, the sorts of jobs that we could do. Realised that study was probably our best path forward. Cathy was accepted to do a degree course at the University of the Highlands and Islands, although it was the Millennium Institute then.
It's UHR Millennium Institute, and it was actually as a result of the Highland Homecoming program that was promoted in Australia that got us thinking the student visa out with the post-study work visa.
So in the course of planning some 7 years ahead in terms of uprooting ourselves, years of researching it, then probably a year in the planning and execution to actually move from Australia to Scotland, to then for Cathy to do her 4 years of study and then move on to the post-study work visa. So there was about 7 years of planning put in place and executed, to then find out, it was probably over a year after we were here that we found out that the post-study work visa was being retroactively abolished. And even when we did find out, we didn't realise that it was retroactive and that it actually applied to us. We're now in a situation where, through the enormous efforts of some close friends who publicised our situation through the tireless representations of our local MP, we're now in a situation where we have till the 1st of August to submit a complying application. We're still waiting on advice from the Home Office as to even what form it is we're supposed to be filling out.
Could you just, your current condition, therefore, could you maybe help us a little bit more understand where you actually are? You've been given a temporary leave to remain within the United Kingdom. And in that period, you've got to find a job which meets the requirements of the Tier 2 visa route to remain in the UK. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, the requirements for the Tier 2 work visa, if I can try to summarise those, there's about a 1,500-page document called the Standardised Occupational Classification Codes, which describe the various jobs, the likely titles, typical responsibilities. It has to fulfil one of those, as well as minimum salary criteria. So what you're effectively having to do is go straight from study. You have, under the current arrangement, although we've been given 2 months, under the current arrangement, if you were finishing your degree, you would have typically 4 months to go straight from study into a fairly successful, high-paying position with a signing bonus, effectively. Because your employer is going to have to pay the Home Office about £2,000, is probably going to have to pay an immigration lawyer a similar amount for the application in professional fees. So you're walking in cold into an interview saying, not only am I the most outstanding applicant that you're going to see today, but I'm worth spending £4,000 over what you would spend on everybody else.
For the sponsorship
license, together with dozens of hours of your own time in actually preparing the application.
And there's also the fact that the salary has to be of a level of £20,800. Is that correct?
That's the minimum salary. It is higher for some of the listed professions. Yes.
So you're currently in the process of trying to find a job that meets all those requirements, which gets your salary £20,800. And if you do not meet these requirements, what happens next?
If we do not meet these requirements, we would have absolutely no chance of making a complying application. We are very fortunate that over the time that we've been here, we've actually been close to achieving that 3 times, despite the odds being against us. Cathy actually at the moment has an offer of a job with a local community-funded distillery, Glenwivis Distilleries, as their history curator. This is a distillery which has links to the Ferrantosh distillery of Burns fame.
Yep. Could I just ask, when you first, you said you became interested in Scotland when you visited here, you'd like to made up your mind you'd like to make it home. Did you get any indication when you first applied for the study visa that there was ever going to be an issue further down the line, or did you come here with full confidence that you would be a matter of doing your qualification, you would find a job through a route that was described to you and one that you found was actually going to work for you?
Certainly, and I'd actually like to correct some of the Westminster record on the subject. Mr Brokenshire listed in an urgent question just about every transaction that we'd had with the Home Office, and made a point and repeated it twice, that we arrived in June 2011 when the announcement for the revocation of the post-study work visa happened the previous March, 3 months beforehand. There was one transaction that Mr Brokenshire omitted from his chronology, which was that our visas were applied for and granted in 2010, the year before this was announced.
Yeah, because 2011 was when the post-study works visa was abolished.
March 2011 was when the
announcement.
revocation was announced, and I use that word advisedly.
Yep.
The Home Office takes enormous amounts of detail from people in visa applications. We had to supply 15 years worth of photography of the two of us together to prove that we were in fact a stable couple.
Yes.
And that this wasn't some sort of a scam that we were trying to get into the UK on. We had to provide contact addresses for by which they could contact us through Australia, prospective contact address in the UK, in addition to mobile phone numbers that we would have still valid for our first few weeks in the UK, email addresses. Despite having all this and the ease with which bulk emails can be sent now, the Home Office, near as I can tell from our records, we've had it would have been a fairly straightforward matter for the Home Office to send a bulk email to people who were likely to be affected by a change in the visas saying this was coming up.
Yeah.
I've got no record of having received one. In May 2011, after this announcement was supposed to have occurred, we were advised by our very successful and very helpful immigration consultant in Australia, who actually helped successfully get us over here to the UK, that the post-study work visa was a valid pathway, that we should be getting ourselves set up and doing these things to make sure, planning years ahead, doing these things now to make sure that you have everything in place, all your ducks in a row, as it were, ready for that application. And that was weeks after the announcement. People whose jobs are on the line and keeping themselves up to date were not aware of it.
Well, you probably will be aware that this committee has done a report which is ready to go. We had to wait until the European referendum was concluded, so I would like you to have a look at that when it's produced and just see if there was anything available in what we say that would have helped your situation. We can ask Mr Blackford the type of representations that you have made in order to try and secure an arrangement where Mr and Mrs Bain are able to stay in Scotland.
Well, when Greg and Catherine first came to me, it was actually during a recess period, and that proved to be a little bit of an obstacle, because in terms of actually trying to get an audience with the Minister proved to be difficult. I think it's fair to say that both myself and my office bombarded him by making sure that we can get an appointment, and the first day that we got back after recess, I had that meeting with him, and all the way through, what I've said to the Minister is that there's a breach of faith and a breach of trust by the UK government. Greg and Catherine took the decision that they wanted to come and contribute to Highland life, to make a contribution to the growth of our economy. Lachlan studying at the Garrick Medium Unit at Dingwall Primary School. Important characteristics in terms of what we need young families to come and live and work in the area to deliver prosperity in the Highlands. And I explained to the Minister that they came here on an expectation that they would benefit from the post-study work visa, and that this had been, as Greg has said, has been retrospectively removed. Now, all the way through, what I've argued is that his argument was that if he did this, he would be creating a precedent, and there'd be lots of other people. And I've long argued that given that most people, if not everyone, would now have gone through that process, hardly anybody would be affected by this. And indeed, I had an answer to a written question I put down last week, but they will not tell me how many people are in this situation, because they argue that the cost would be disproportionate. In other words, they know that there's hardly anybody there, and he's not willing to do the right thing and to give the family the opportunity to work in the interim while they satisfy the criteria for the post-study work visa. Now, whilst the Minister has been helpful to an extent insofar as he has granted extensions for the family to satisfy the criteria, it's put enormous strain and pressure on the family, as Greg has explained, that they've been very close to satisfying the Tier 2 visa requirements in a number of instances. The whole point about granting the family the right to remain under the post-study work visa is it does two things. when it grants them sufficient time to be able to satisfy the criteria, which is all we're asking for. No one's asking to create an exception of a long-term right to stay. What we're asking is that the family be given the opportunity to meet the criteria, which should have been the case because they should have benefited from this in the first case. And the second thing is that whilst the family are going through this process, they're not entitled to work. So Greg had to give up employment. The family are not in a position where they can support themselves. This makes no sense. All we're asking is that there is compassion shown towards the family, and that's the argument I've had in all the meetings I've had with the Minister. I've raised urgent questions, I've had oral questions, I've had written questions, and I would have to say that that has been supported by a large number of MPs across party, and I'm very grateful for that, because I think when most people hear the story, they're rather perplexed that the government would behave in such an inhumane manner, because that's what it is.
Chris?
Yes, it's a question to yourself, Ian. Can you give examples of other experiences that have made it difficult for your constituents to remain in the UK after studying here in Scotland?
I'm not aware of any other situation which is similar to this, Chris. And I have other immigration cases I'm pursuing, but you'll appreciate that given that those are not in the public domain, I can't go public on them. But there are other instances of other people, I would argue, that have been treated in an unfair manner. And again, I think it comes back to the basic issue here is that the Highlands, as the Member of Parliament for Gordon, Alex Salmon, has famously said on a number of occasions, we're not full up. We need to grow the Highland economy, and here we have a family and there are others that want to contribute to our life here. And the government are acting in a way which is detrimental to our interests.
Margaret Ferrier.
Can I make a comment there
yes,
as well?
Please.
As I'm sure the panel is well aware, we were unfortunately in the situation where we were the subject of global attention a few weeks ago when this story broke. With the instant connectivity of the internet and social media, our profile on Facebook was hitting over 30,000 shares at one point. I am not aware of one other person who has stuck their hand up anywhere and said, me too.
Yeah.
For the post-study work visa issue.
Well, that's very important, I think. Margaret Ferrier.
Thanks, Chair. I think that obviously one of your main concerns that we've heard throughout all of this is about your son and the fact that he is attending at the medium primary school in Dingwall, and that he's one of his teachers has actually said that moving him from here back to Australia would have an adverse effect on his studies going forward. So we can see that that's a major concern, apart from the financial side of things. But how difficult has it been then to find work with a tier 2 sponsor, and what kind of jobs have you been looking for?
Well, if I can cover off the comment as well as the question. Lachlan's education here through the Gaelic medium was something that we decided on as being very important for him. The opportunity to be brought up bilingually from an early age was important. Being of Highland descent, my wife's maiden name is Monroe. My family on my mother's side are McKinnons and McMillans from Skye.
Just up the road.
Yeah, my mother's ashes spread over a graveyard at Kilcroist on the Elgol Road, not many miles from here. Bringing Lachlan up in the culture of our family has been something that was very important to us. We felt it as a duty almost to help reinvigorate Gaelic culture. I understand Mr. Danton, one of your earlier witnesses, talk about a need for breeding pairs. I think he quite bluntly put it. I would submit you have them in front of you. But that's been something that's been very important. I am linguistically challenged, I'll freely admit that. My wife is fractionally better than I am. Lachlan far better than either of us. For the two of us, about as much as I could say is Habech and Gaelic again. But Lachlan is fluent for his age and stage of development. He has had no formal, he's competed in mods for 4 years now. He has had no formal education in English. That ordinarily starts at P4 in Gaelic medium. Now that means if we were to go back to Australia now, he would be going back into probably P3, probably the second half of P3, because it runs on a calendar year basis in Australia. Having had no formal education in Gaelic, it would place him at least 2 years behind his peers academically. No matter how successful and clever he sees himself as now, you get told in the most constructive terms, no, you've got it wrong, do it again. That will impact on your self-image as to how you view education, probably for the rest of your life. For James Brokenshire to say that this would impose, and I think the exact words were, no unreasonable difficulty, is something I find astonishing for a government who would penalise somebody who keeps their children away from school for 2 weeks.
You'll know the focus of this inquiry is to look at the particular issues to do with population and demography in Scotland, and we've heard quite compelling evidence that there are specific challenges in Scotland. We're hearing positive news stories about the Highlands of Scotland and about how population has increased, which we're all really grateful for and happy to hear. But there are still massive issues. We've heard again today that there's a disparity around the Highland area, and I think it was yourself that said there, Mr. Brain, that like the breeding pairs, the immigration which has helped secure this. What particular skills and what particular skills would you be in a position to bring to Scotland in order to try and meet some of the challenges that we've got in our immigration and demography?
Well, my own personal skill set is in civil policy, design and health and safety. Although my qualifications weren't recognised when I came here, I had to then again at my own expense study further for what's called the local NEBOSH accreditation. But mainly what it sounds kind of sad from my own perspective. The main thing I'd like to think that I'm bringing to Scotland is my son. He's been our primary motivating factor here.
Mr. Blackford.
Yeah, I mean, this is I think a very important topic that you're raising, Pete. I mean, let me give you an example of the part of Skye that I live in, Wartonish, which, like other parts of Skye, has seen an increase in its population over the last 50 years. I know you covered that this morning. 35% of the population in Wartonish are over 65. So when we talk about demographic challenges that we have in Scotland, that's a much sharper focus here in the Highlands. And whilst there are many good stories to be told, I think the existence of the University of the Highlands and Islands is transformational in allowing young people to be educated here up to degree level, something that could not happen in the past. And Catherine, of course, has come in and participated with that. But we need to create a competitive advantage in order that young families will come and want to stay and live here. And so really, the major challenge I believe that we face is really one of connectivity. And that's true if you're talking about transport, traditional transport connectivity. It's also true when you talk about digital connectivity. And when you come here to Skye today, I guess some people, when they come here for the first time, might be surprised at the size of the island and just simply the task of getting around it, the task of getting here and the task of getting off here. Now, we've faced some issues with the ferry from Armadale over the course of the summer period, and the way that we've not been fairly treated in terms of making sure that we've got a ferry which is fit for purpose. We have one road off Skye which regularly gets blocked by traffic accidents and so on and so forth. There's enormous investment which is going on in the A9, which of course we all welcome, but we also need to play cognizance of the require for decent road connectivity on the western side of the country as well. And then of course you come to digital connectivity, and you'll have experienced just coming here the difficulty of getting mobile reception as you travel from the east to the west side of the country, and then broadband that's been covered. So we're going to lose people if they cannot get the basics of life, which is what connectivity is. So we need to make sure that government, when that's true whether that's in London or Edinburgh, recognises the challenges that we face and give us the helping hand that allows us to help ourselves.
Could I put 2 points to you in response to all that? And you're right about the dependence ratio, because this is what this committee has heard, that we've got a shrinking working age population, which is therefore expected to support an elderly population which is described as economically inactive. Though there's a conversation about that too, about what we mean by these terms. And it seems like Scotland lags behind the rest of the UK when it comes to that dependency ratio, and we also lag behind European average. And it seems again that the Highlands lag behind the rest of Scotland when it comes to this. How do we start to address this particular issue? How do we grow the population of Scotland to try and address this? And where do couples like Mr. and Mrs. Brain fit into how we achieve that?
Well, we need to make it a place where people can compete. I mean, I can give you an example of a business based in Ballyvillage, which is a world-leading business in rope access. But because of problems of connectivity, they've had to open an office in Glasgow. So a business that's based in the Highlands, that's thriving, in order to compete effectively, has had to effectively go away. So that's not right, and that's what I mean about making sure that we have the right level of connectivity. If we can offer people digital connectivity and decent transport connectivity, an airport in Skye, for example, then we'll increase the opportunities for people to relocate here. More Gregs and Catherines, whether they come from Scotland or further afield, that want to be part of the story of the growth of the Highlands. This is a tremendous place to live and work. Digital connectivity should open up opportunities for people to run businesses in the Highlands and Islands. I think you've only got to look at what's happening in Slate, and you can look at the success around the college. Slate has been a success story. You can see other businesses which have developed here. There's an architect's building in this business, for example. There's the new distillery which is coming here. So this is a beacon of hope, but it's about creating more beacons of hope throughout the Highlands and Islands. People recognising that you need to put that desire of delivering decent social services so we can look after our elderly with an entrepreneurial culture. For an entrepreneurial culture to develop, you need the tools to allow you to do that, and that's where government comes in.
Can I also make a point there that there is an enormous resource waiting for the Highlands to take use of it, and that is the Scottish diaspora. If any of you have ever been in Eastern Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa on January the 1st, you will have seen that there are none so Scottish as diasporatic Scots.
That's where we came in, really.
For tens of thousands of them, millions of them, there is a dream that they would one day return to live in Scotland. Of those millions, there are thousands who would actually get up and do it if they could see a way.
Chris Law.
And I think on that note, a very straight question: would Scotland clearly benefit from having its own immigration policy?
Chris, there is absolutely no question, because we have an immigration policy which is not fit for purpose, and that's really what Greg has just described. I mean, I used the expression that Alex Salmond has used many times: Scotland's not full up. We need to counteract the challenge that we have from an ageing population. We need to attract people in, whether that's from the diaspora, whether that's from Europe. We need to disengage ourselves from the horrible immigration debate which has been part of the EU referendum. And we've all seen the increase in hate crime that has developed, particularly in England, over the course of the last few days. So we really need to start to tell the story about how immigration enriches us. The positive story about how immigrants can bring economic prosperity to an area, how we can revitalise the Highlands. So absolutely yes, we need to have control of immigration policy in Scotland, so we can define an immigration policy which is fit for purpose for us, about making the Highlands and Scotland a destination.
We heard this morning from Professor Hunter. I know you're familiar with his work, and he talked about the centuries of emigration from Scotland and how there's a particular different attitude towards immigration here in the Highlands. Is that something, again, as a Member of Parliament for this area, that you recognise, and does that therefore mean that we should be looking at the Highlands as a different area, maybe not just from the whole of the UK but even from Scotland when it comes to these issues?
Absolutely, because as I travel around the constituency, as I have done before being elected and over the course of the last 14 months, I cannot recall a situation where people have talked negatively about immigrants coming to the Highlands. People welcome the likes of Catherine and Greg and Lachlan that have come here, and others, because we recognise that it's what shapes us. This has historically been a nation of migrants. We're a mongrel nation, as has been described before, so we've got nothing to fear from migration. We want to encourage migration to Scotland, and particularly to the Highlands.
And just on the European referendum and the outcome and results, was I correct in hearing throughout this case, and when it's been highlighted in the press, that those that were advocating a leave vote, suggesting that cases like your own may be looked at more favourably if we were to leave the European Union? Was that something I heard, or was that something that you took seriously, or
I took it very seriously. I don't think my reaction was entirely positive. Michael Gove did make specific comment on BBC Scottish Breakfast Radio, I think, referring to that family in Dingwall. I can only assume he meant us.
Australian family.
Australian family in Dingwall.
How many Australian families in Dingwall are there?
Save for the name, he was fairly specific. That we would benefit from families like us would benefit from a post-Brexit UK where immigration matters would be a Scottish voice would be given a greater hearing in immigration matters. That I think he said that they had approached Holyrood with an outline of how a devolved immigration, partially at least devolved immigration policy might look in a Brexit scenario. My comment in response to that was simply at the time that any restrictions on our remaining in the UK weren't coming from Holyrood or Brussels.
And I would imagine this is something that your Member of Parliament would like to remind the current
Yeah.
Justice Secretary about.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a correspondence ongoing with the Immigration Minister. I see if I had another letter this morning, although I can't open it. But I mean, I was saying to him, look, we need to go back to the basics here, and the basics are that you have the power to give this family the right to stay under the post-study work visa. You need to reinstigate that. Don't hide behind fig leaves about what you could change in the future. We're actually dealing with the here and now. Do the right thing. Give the family the right to stay. Give them the right to go back to work and to be able to make sure that they can look after their own interests, that they can provide a living for Lachlan and for themselves. Give them the time to be able to qualify for the Tier 2 visa that they need to do so. But do the right thing in the short term, which is the right to live. So don't hide behind an EU referendum. Let's take what has been actually just disgraceful politicking from the Justice Secretary out of this and do the right thing by the family.
Can I ask you, I mean, I know because I've observed it in Parliament, you've had meetings with the Minister, you've had written questions, you even were granted an urgent question from the Speaker. What more is there that you feel that you can do in order to make representations on behalf of them?
I have to say it's absolutely fantastic that this committee is taking an interest in it, so that all helps. And I know that the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Keith Vaz, has also said that he wants to see the family come and address that committee as well. So really over the course of the next few weeks we need to increase the pressure on the government to say to the Minister, look, you still have it within your power to do the right thing. Your answer to me, your written answer last week, really does bring home to us that there's hardly anybody, if anyone at all, that would be in the same situation that Greg and Catherine are. So give them that opportunity to stay under what is rightfully theirs, which is the post-study work visa. And that's really what we're asking for and we'll continue to ask for in the short term.
I've been asked about this in the media this morning, and the way that I've described it and the way that it's been treated, Mr and Mrs Bain have been treated as almost like a second Highland clearance, where we're now removing people of economic active age like there was during the first clearances. I don't know what your views about that, and if
can I
Brain's
say
got
something specific to that, because I used that language and I was criticised for it, but I think it's absolutely right. And it's particularly right that the whole story of clearance was about eviction.
Yep.
Now, because Greg and Catherine are in a situation that they don't have the long-term right to stay here, they were actually evicted from the house they were living in because they were classed effectively as illegal immigrants, for want of a better term. So that whole linkage with the Highland clearance is correct, because frankly that's the way they've been treated.
Has Mr Brain got a view about that? Just how you're obviously somebody interested in the history of Scotland in the area, and where you are and how you fall into that particular, historic episode.
The reason we have Australian accents is because of the clearances.
The reason we're speaking with these disgustingly flat accents is precisely because our family saw no reasonable option but to throw everything that they had and a better life in another country. Far be it from me to make any it's already been made, and I'd like to discourage any links between our previous landlord and Patrick Sellers. He's made his own decisions in his own interest. But we, as I said to you earlier, we made a plan here based on a 6 or 7 year plan. Theresa May said in 2014 that she would welcome immigrants that were willing to culturally assimilate and pay their own way. We'd like to put a bit more onto that offer from our end and say that not only would we be willing to do that, but we will be willing to live and work in what is comparatively a sparsely populated and economically depressed area of the country. Now, there are two circumstances in which you don't need an immigration policy. One is when you let nobody in, one is when you let everybody in. Outside of that, the purpose of an immigration policy must be that you select only those people that are a net asset to the national interest. Now, the detail is where you get the trouble. But if you have a family who have been working, we brought approximately £200,000, and it came over piecemeal at different exchange rates. I can't tell you what the actual value was, but approximately £200,000 of our own cash to this country. We have earned, in the last 4 years while I've been working here, we have paid something like £40,000 or £50,000 in taxes in the time we have been here.
With no recourse to public funds.
With no recourse to public funds. It is an express condition of our visa. To do all of that, planning 7 years ahead, You can understand why I feel that it's an astonishing breach of faith to have recently received a letter from James Brokenshire where he said, and I quote, "Applicants should never assume that provisions in place at the time of their initial entry to the UK will continue to be viable options in future years."
No, just a final comment, and as you said earlier, it's what Lackland will give back to the local area in the years to come, setting aside yourself, Greg and Catherine. You know, it's what Lackland will bring to this area going forward. The world is his oyster, you know.
Yes, well, we have a boy here who is 7.5 years old, is fluent in 2 languages, is doing very well at school, competing confidently, you know, on public stages. This is a lad who has a very bright future ahead of him, who has the ability to contribute linguistically and culturally to this country. He has friends of ours he spends time with who are poets, musicians, performers, professors, linguists, lawyers. He has an astonishingly broad cultural base to which he's been exposed. He has the opportunity to contribute so much to this country.
He's already expressed an interest in becoming a Gaelic teacher one day, so I mean, that's something he's decided from, you know.
And that may change next week. He may be a Gaelic teaching astronaut.
Is there much call for that in Australia?
No. And in fact, to get back to your question about his education, our best outcome were we to return to Australia would be that he would get a bilingually fluent Gaelic and English teacher who could explain the differences in orthography, the differences in spelling conventions, syntax, grammar, and take him through that. The chances of that occurring are essentially zero.
Well, we're eternally grateful and thank you for that, and I hope you do have a look at our work into post-study work schemes. As part of this inquiry, it's quite likely we'll be talking to UK and to Scottish ministers just about some of the major themes that we're looking at, and I would suspect that we will want to raise this with UK ministers once again, given that you have come along here today and give us quite compelling evidence. And I think we will also want to ask as a committee, I think the point that you made, Mr. Brain, and Mr. Blackford made, just about how many other people are in your situation. And if that can't be answered through written question, then there may be other means available to try and secure that information.
Can I also just reiterate an implication I think you made earlier in this last week? That a lot of what you've heard today has been personal, which I'm quite grateful for. There has been a lot of talk about numbers and statistics, about arbitrary limits for immigration, about scores on immigration application forms. All of these things have enormous human impacts. And something that is completely lacking, I wouldn't even say sadly lacking, I would say completely lacking from the immigration process is compassion. There seems to be no allowance whatsoever for the human impacts of the decisions that are made.
Because that impacts not just on us personally,
not
as
just
a
on
family,
us
it's
and
the
Lackland
community
and
we're
the
part
wider
of.
community. We're aware of friends who are shopkeepers in a very small rural village who are not, despite their visa troubles, are not anxious for public attention, and I won't mention the name. Who are the lifeblood of a small community. You have to travel 30 miles to
just
get
on that, and I know Mr. Blackford, as a Member of Parliament, can't raise other specific issues and cases, but I think since your case has emerged, all of us have been contacted by individuals and constituents who are not in the same situation, they're in the same spectrum of difficulties of their experience in this, and you know, like, and I personally have had that in my constituency, and I know other colleagues have. So one thing that you may have usefully added to is a debate about all of this, and I think, and I don't know if you've got any sort of views about the response that you've had, particularly in some of your media appearances that you've made, and you know, I don't know if there's been petitions that have been set up or messages of goodwill. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about that, but you know, certainly the way that I've observed this, that there's a message which has quite clearly got through about all of this and about what's happened.
We're enormously grateful that our situation has had some sort of cut through on the immigration debate in this country. We've been absolutely overwhelmed by the support that we've had. We've had some close friends who set up a Facebook page who were talking to their friends in radio stations and media who
that's what got us the profile.
The snowflake that started this avalanche. It's something that we went into with no small degree of ambivalence. We didn't move to a small village in the Highlands for the attention. It was something that we weren't anxious to do, but again, if it was something, Lachlan's our prime motivating factor. If it was going to be able to do something that would help him, then there was no barrier that we wouldn't consider. And so we've been really fortunate that we've had incredibly loyal friends. An MP who we would send emails to after midnight to have the phone ring 30 seconds later with a response.
Because he knew we were awake, because we just hit the
because
send
he just
button.
liked it arrive in his email. To have had, I don't know what it is about our particular story, and it's no credit to us that it's something that's captured the nation's imagination, but I'm glad that it has. I'm glad that it has brought this to the attention so that people like our friends in Largan, the Phillips family in Glasgow, Mr. Monongo with his citizenship application, and dozens of others with spousal
Could I suggest
applications.
to you it's the
get
dignified,
some attention.
articulate and passionate way that you've put forward your own personal circumstances. I think that's had an enormous chime with the Scottish people, and I think as a committee we want to congratulate you for the way that you have pursued this, and we will see what we can do to take up this issue in the future.
Can I just say one thing on that, Pete, because I think it's important. At one point the Minister said to me, you're going to make sure, on the basis that I haven't done what you want us to do, that you're going to get maximum publicity. And I kind of smiled at it and said, well, yes, because you're not doing the right thing. If you did the right thing, this story would go away, because Greg and Catherine have got no real desire to be front page in the newspapers. If the Minister responds in the correct manner, this story will have an ending, and it will have a happy ending.
And can I also say that we don't see this as a nationalistic or a party political issue. We see it as a bureaucracy issue. I would have, I have had difficulty with some of the answers that we've got back from the Immigration Department and from Mr. Brokenshire personally, and that has caused difficulty in the way I view how things have occurred. At the outset of this, if Mr. Brokenshire had wanted to appear beside us at a press conference saying, I've reviewed the further leave to remain application that they made, acknowledged that there were errors of fact and law in it, such as there were, that I have ordered a review and as such have decided that we'll go forward with a 2-year further leave to remain and a right to work. I can't give you a post-study work visa because they don't exist anymore, but I can do 2 years under the FLRO with a right to work. That's within my remit. And I'm making this decision because it is the right decision in the national interest. I would have happily stood there, smiled, shook the man's hand, and that would have been the end of that. If he's done that with a confidentiality agreement. We're not doing it for the attention. And look, I thank you for your comments. I thank you for the time that you've given us today. I really do appreciate it. If it helps us and people in similar situations, then now, as I've said to other people before, when we started out with this, we were just complaining to anyone who would listen. Since then, we've realised that we can become global headlines if that's what it takes. We can change the face of the immigration debate in this country if that's what it takes. If you would pass on to Mr. Brokenshire, we will not go away.
Yeah, well, I'm really grateful, and I think from all the committee and for coming at short notice and giving us that compelling evidence. And as part of this inquiry, we will most definitely be raising this in any way that we can. So thank you for coming today. Again, if there's anything further that you observe in the course of the inquiry, you might want to look at the Minister's evidence, for example, and feel that you want to contribute to this inquiry, please get in touch with us again. But thank you today, and thank you to you, Mr. Black, for coming along to Order.